Kansas City 911.
I need an ambulance.
Hold on, stay on the line, IAmAKiller. Stay on the line.
I was praying that they would save him.
This is a personal thing.
The guy shot him twice and then said, remember me, bitch.
We have two names. We have no idea who they are.
If they go inside, we know we will have them at that point.
Your adrenaline is going. It was very exciting.
Without the surveillance in this case, we'd have been left with just names.
He asked me where I left the gun.
It was the biggest nightmare I've ever had in my life.
Father of three, Rodney Thurber repairs computers for a living in the apartment he shares with his girlfriend, Nadia Cole.
This one, hon?
Perfect, yes.
I met Rodney in 2016 through an ad for a room. Just a very sweet and generous man. He loved spending time with his kids. I needed some help, and I needed a place to stay. We just hit it off.
Do you want that?
Yeah.
Rodney liked working on computers. He was teaching me how to put them back together, how to take them apart, how to replace things that didn't work. He was a very smart man. He was constantly reading anything and everything. He had a very high IQ. We had fun together, especially learning the computer.
It's good to know.
He made it fun. We connected very well.
Want to stream a movie?
That day, we were just kind of lounged around all day. We were going to watch a movie and just sit and talk. It was just going to be the two of us. But we didn't get very far with it.
Kansas City 911.
I need an ambulance.
Hold on, stay on the line, IAmAKiller. Stay on the line.
Our dispatch received a 911 call about a shooting. The calling party was very hysterical, very emotional. There was yelling in the background.
Moments later, dispatch receives another call about the same incident.
Kansas City 911.
Someone got stuck. Someone came here and shot this guy.
The shooting that occurred in the second story of a converted house.
Do you know him, the person who was shot?
Yeah, Rodney, he's our neighbor. He just got shot in here. Can y'all come, please? He's losing consciousness.
Officers were dispatched to the scene where the shooting had occurred.
115 and 117 are almost at point there.
Officers arrived at Tracy Avenue where the 911 call came from. There were witnesses that were downstairs waiting for police. Officers go up the stairs to the top apartment and locate a female and the victim. He is laying in a pool of blood and was not conscious when officers arrived. As medics arrive and police are still rendering aid, unfortunately, Rodney succumbs to his injuries and is pronounced deceased at the scene.
I was praying that they would save him. That there's no way he could die. That man is too stubborn to die. He's gonna live forever. He loved us.
A homicide investigation was initiated at that point.
Ma'am, can I get your name, please?
Our calling party, who was identified as Nadia Cole, she was very emotional.
Officers removed Nadia from the scene. She is clearly distraught after seeing Rodney die.
She's placed into a warm police vehicle where an officer sits with her, tries to console her as best they can. Officers got brief statements from the downstairs neighbors who had kind of described hearing Mr. Thurber yelling. He shot me, called police.
Can you describe his features? How old? How tall?
No, sir. I know he was a white male.
They gave us a description of a male running from the scene, but as far as specifics, it was very difficult. None of them were able to give us a very good description.
Homicide detectives arrive on scene at 6:50 p.m.
What do you got?
I was the first investigator there. Mr. Thurber had suffered at least 2 gunshot wounds, one to his right side, one to the left shoulder. There was some damage to the back door where you could tell that it had been kicked. We found a shoe print. That led me to believe that this is a personal thing. He knew what he was going there to do. He knew who he was looking for and what his intentions were.
I was the on-call prosecutor, so I arrived on scene and made contact with the detectives that night.
We ID'd the victim, got a witness to the shooting, and possible shoe prints of the suspect.
The evidence that we were looking for were shell casings, spent bullets, things like that. There was an actual spent bullet that had lodged itself in the door.
There were 4 shell casings that were recovered. They were a .380 caliber casing.
Any sign of the murder weapon?
We determined that the suspect probably took the firearm with him because it was not found on scene as we were processing Mr. Thurber's apartment. We located a cell phone in what we determined was his bedroom. It was taken back to police headquarters for processing and downloading of information. If you can get into it, it's gold because you know who they've been in contact with and what might have caused this to happen. We now had shell casings, a spent bullet, this shoe print, and now, we found Mr. Thurber's phone. So we have a lot of really good leads to go on. We start to look for possible surveillance cameras and the house directly north of where Mr. Thurber's residence was. There were surveillance cameras that were on the house. I was optimistically excited.
Investigators take the footage from the neighbor's camera to the police department for review.
You're just nervous and hopeful that the footage is actually captured on the camera.
Okay. Queue up 5 minutes before the 911.
I was excited because it captured the actual driveway that someone would have had gone down to get back to Rodney's apartment. We knew if it's a car, if it's a person, we're going to capture something.
Hold it. Show that again.
About 2 minutes prior to the 911 call, a figure walks down the driveway. This is so close in proximity to the shooting that this is probably our suspect.
Punch in. Pause it.
Quality of the footage was not great, but it was enough to give us a figure wearing a coat, walking down the driveway at 6:11 p.m.
Stay on.
This figure, it cuts through a gate and into the driveway to where Mr. Thurber's apartment is.
Keep going.
Approximately 6:14, which is about the time the 911 call comes in, the video captures what appears to be that same individual. They don't exit and go the way that they came. They turn and go the opposite direction towards Manuel Cleaver 2 Boulevard.
That's our perp, 100%.
Anything happened before the man arrives?
We went back approximately an hour and watched the video to see any comings and goings of anyone that was coming to or leaving the apartment. Approximately 5:39, we observe what appears to be a gray or silver BMW that pulls into the drive. Approximately 8 minutes after, we observe the same vehicle leaving, but going southbound towards Manuel Cleaver 2 Boulevard. The fact that the car turns and goes the same direction that our suspect leaves, it does kind of pique our interest. Does this car have something to do with this crime?
Rewind. Punch in on the plates.
Unfortunately, because of the lighting and the way that this camera is set up, we couldn't make out the front or the back license plates on it.
Investigators switch gears. They interview Nadia Cole to unlock any clues she has about who shot her boyfriend.
We have to be able to determine if they have information that's relevant to the shooting. We also have to eliminate them as a possible suspect.
Okay. So then just kind of walk me through what happened.
I'm here and knock at the door. We weren't expecting anybody, so Rodney came with me. I went to open the door, and Rodney says, "Don't open it." And no more than he said that, I already had it open, and the guy shot him twice, and then said, "Remember me, bitch." Rodney says, "Who are you? Tell us your name." And he says, "I'm Patrick. I'm Caitlin's boyfriend." And then shot him again.
So now we have two names. We have no idea who they are.
That was very odd. It's not very common that we were able to get an information like that from a shooter in real time.
Does that make sense to you? Some dude's going to come up and murder your boyfriend, but he's going to tell him his real name?
He's not real bright, apparently.
And describe him for me.
Long, shoulder-length brown hair. Kind of looked like he hadn't brushed it in days. Long brown beard. Big, heavy coat.
When she was asked, had she ever seen him before, she said, I had never seen him. I didn't know who he was. Not only do we have Patrick's name as our shooter, but we also have Caitlin. We asked Nadia, do you know Caitlin? And she says, I've seen her a few times.
Tell me all you can tell me about Caitlin.
She's white, blonde hair, blue-eyed, girl next door look.
Okay, what's Caitlin's last name?
I don't know.
She only knows her name is Caitlin. She doesn't know her last name. She doesn't know where she lives.
She believed that Rodney and Caitlin had, at one point, had some kind of a romantic relationship. And now Nadia is in a relationship with Rodney, and that raises the question for us, is there a jealousy aspect to do with this?
One of the weird things Nadia tells police is that she says Caitlin had come over prior to the shooting and had left this little handgun and asked her to hold on to it.
So tell me how Caitlin came to have you hold this gun for them, or her.
She came over 2 or 3 days ago. She asked me if there was somewhere she could put it until she could come back and get it.
And why did she want you to keep it again?
She didn't really say.
When Nadia gave us the information about holding the gun for Caitlin, obviously it raised some questions. A reasonable person would be like, well, why am I holding this gun for you? She could never really answer us other than, well, because Rodney said it was okay.
You see Caitlin today?
Yeah, she came to pick up the gun.
So about 30 minutes before the shooting, Caitlin arrives at Rodney's apartment. Rodney gave her the gun, and she left.
Given the odd circumstances surrounding this gun, detectives ask Nadia if she's involved in the shooting.
There's a lot of stuff that is not getting told right now, okay? And I don't know why you're keeping some things from me, Did you shoot Rodney?
No.
Okay.
I would never shoot him.
Okay.
Did Nadia have something to do with setting this up? Because, well, if I can't have him, then nobody's going to have him type thing. For us to be able to eliminate her as a suspect, we asked her to download her phone, and she, without hesitating, said, absolutely, I will cooperate.
Detective Wells informs Rodney's family of their loved one's murder.
The hardest part of any homicide investigation or death investigation is making contact with the family. It was very emotional for them. Of course, they wanted more answers than I could give at that time.
While investigators wait for the report on Nadia's phone data, they hunt for sources of surveillance footage in the area around Rodney's apartment.
At the end of the block, right on Emmanuel Cleaver 2 Boulevard, they had just built a McDonald's, which we knew was going to have some kind of surveillance cameras.
Back at the police department, investigators review the camera footage from the day of Rodney's murder.
Knowing that our suspect had run south towards the McDonald's, we were hopeful that we could find footage that would show this individual on any of their cameras.
He came from Tracy Avenue. Do you have any cameras pointed that way?
We were focusing on the camera that is facing the Tracy Avenue, overlooking the McDonald's parking lot.
He was seen at the house around 6:14 p.m., so play from that.
We wanted to see, around the 911 call, if there was going to be an individual that was walking south on Tracy.
Punch in.
And around 6:14, we see an individual appear walking south on Tracy.
Hold it.
He's wearing the exact type of clothes that was described by Nadia as our shooter, coming from the exact direction of our crime scene.
It's the guy who was at Rodney's apartment.
Play on. Change cameras. Zoom in.
Can you enhance it?
We're unable to see the actual face of the suspect.
Switch angles. Where's he going? Any other cameras facing that way?
He ends up heading north and runs across the street and off camera, and we lose sight of him through the camera angles.
It's frustrating because I still can't say who he is.
Investigators continue to watch the footage in case the suspect returns.
Play on. Rewind that. Stop.
About 30 seconds after the suspect leaves camera view, we see a silver sedan, similar size, make, and model of our suspect car from the previous footage.
Change cameras.
What are they waiting for?
3 minutes passed, and the car is just sitting in the parking lot.
Show me the other angles.
And then we see our suspect. He starts running across the street back towards the McDonald's.
Punch in.
His coat is now open, his hood is off his head, and we see his long brown hair. We see facial hair.
Follow him.
He actually runs up to this silver sedan. He gets in the passenger seat.
The BMW backs out and leaves the parking lot. You know, the suspect, similar to the description that Nadia had given during her statement. However, we still don't have a license plate for the BMW. We still don't know who Caitlin is. And all we have for him is his name is Patrick.
This is all after the murder. The car was seen at the house 30 minutes before.
We wanted to rewind the McDonald's footage and look back towards that 5:48 time period where that sedan left the victim's house and drove south on Tracy.
Okay, jump back half an hour. Okay, stop there.
About a half hour prior to the murder is when we see the sedan drive through the McDonald's parking lot.
It's the same car.
It drives up and it gets in line of the drive-through.
We are very excited because we think we actually might see who's involved in this.
Show me the payment counter. Punch in.
We're able to see who the driver is. It's a blonde-haired female, matching the description that Nadia gave us of Caitlin.
Show me the other cameras.
We can see that there is an individual sitting in the passenger seat.
Unfortunately, we're unable to see his face.
Switch to the other camera. Punch in on the car tag.
We can determine that it is a temporary tag, which is issued when you buy a car, but it's not visible. We've gotten to a point where we've collected all the information that we can get from the surveillance video.
We were able to download Rodney's phone. And in that phone, we were able to locate text messages on the day of the homicide between Rodney and an individual who identifies herself as Kate.
Look at this.
This Kate individual is talking with Rodney about coming over and picking up a gun.
It was very specific about she needed to get this gun back from him, that her boyfriend was going to be mad if she didn't get it back.
Fits with what Nadia said.
All we have is Kate and a phone number. At the disposal of law enforcement are many systems, including databases.
We put the number in and it comes back to someone with the name of Caitlin Riffle. Once we had that, then we start using analysts to help us to find a Facebook account.
Got you.
The photographs are kind of similar in appearance to the female that we see at the McDonald's in the drive-through surveillance.
This was another huge break in the case. But the text messages weren't the only thing we recovered off Rodney's phone. There was a photograph of a gun, a .380.
We knew that we had .380 shell casings at the scene.
Can you get a serial number off that?
Some of it.
Zooming in on the serial number itself, we were able to read most of the serial number in this photograph that was on his phone. However, the first character was kind of distorted. That information was sent to detectives in our illegal firearms squad.
Hey, it's Detective Wells. I'm gonna send you a serial number I need a trace on. Thanks. Wow, look at this.
There were multiple photos of a silver BMW, and there were text messages connected to Caitlin asking him to try and sell this silver BMW. Not only did he have photographs of a .380 caliber handgun, the same type of caliber that was used to kill him on his phone, but also photographs of the same type of car that his murder and accomplice used.
Hold on.
Detective Wells notices there's a temporary tag on the back of the car, and this temporary tag has the VIN number.
I'll look up the partial.
He rushes through the police database to see if this VIN is associated with any police reports.
Got it.
It was determined that that car was stolen 5 days prior to the homicide.
It's been found.
We got lucky. The day after the homicide, this car was abandoned in a Walmart parking lot in Lee Summit, Missouri.
It's possible that the security cameras at the Walmart captured images of the suspect and Caitlin. Investigators make the 21-mile journey to Lee Summit to review the store's surveillance footage.
We're trying to get a better look at the suspect's face. They have surveillance video that covers their parking lots, which is where the car was dumped.
Stop. Zoom in.
A male subject gets out of the passenger seat.
Switch to the next camera. He's heading towards the store.
The subject walks towards the doors of the Walmart.
If they go inside, we know we will get clear images of their face. We know we will have them at that point.
He's heading towards the store.
He's just strolling into Walmart like it's any other day.
Stop. We got him.
I was excited, but I knew that there were still additional steps that we had to take to prove that this is Patrick.
Follow him.
We track this individual we know as Patrick now through the Walmart.
Give me to the till.
He ends up making a purchase.
Can we pull up that transaction record?
He buys a tea, and we're able to track that purchase. Walmart gives us the point-of-sale receipt and tells us that he used a gift card to make that purchase.
Do you know where he got the card?
The gift card was purchased 21 hours earlier from a different Walmart in Independence, 9 miles north of Lee Summit.
This transaction for this gift card occurred 2 hours after the homicide.
Thank you.
Detectives are able to recover the footage from the Walmart in Independence.
Okay, start with the camera over the parking lot. Okay, the transaction was for 8:50 p.m., so let's play about an hour before that.
Around 8:09, we're able to see the silver sedan BMW pull into the parking lot.
Play on.
A female gets out of the car.
Freeze it there. Punch in. Is that Caitlin?
This female takes 2 children inside. And then we see another person get out of the car and walk towards the front door.
Switch to inside.
As the doors open, we start watching the interior cameras.
It appears to be Caitlin with her 2 kids walking in the store.
And we see our suspect.
He returned something and they were not able to give him cash. They gave him a Walmart gift card.
Follow him outside.
Patrick walks back to the car. Caitlin follows minutes later.
This footage shows that Caitlin is with this individual after the homicide, just like she was prior to the homicide.
Investigators check in with Rodney's girlfriend, Nadia Cole, to see if she recognizes the woman from the surveillance footage. Nadia is staying in a hotel for her own safety.
I presented her with some photographs that we had taken from the surveillance video at the McDonald's and the drive-thru. And without hesitating, she said, yes, that is Caitlin. That's the Caitlin I know that Rodney was in contact with.
Police also show Nadia the images of the gun.
When the detectives showed me a picture of it, I recognized it, and it looked similar to the one she had handed me.
Thank you. This has been extremely helpful.
The detectives are closing in on the suspects, but Nadia is feeling the toll.
I didn't have anybody to talk to, so I was left on my own. I was mad, I was hurt, I was scared. It was the biggest nightmare I've ever had in my life.
Investigators know that Caitlin is Caitlin Riffle. They now need to identify Patrick.
One of the items that we found on Rodney's phone was the photo of the .380 handgun. We were able to trace the serial number on the gun. We were able to determine that it was legally purchased at a store in Lee Summit, Missouri by Stephanie Powell.
Can you look her up?
Look at this.
She has a son by the name of Patrick Powell.
Can you pull up his license?
Photo's old.
When we run his Missouri Department of Revenue driver's license photo, he has short hair. In the surveillance video, the suspect had long hair. So our first thought is, has he changed what he looks like, or is this a completely different person?
Investigators search for a link between Caitlin and Patrick Powell.
There is an application on a computer that shows when anyone pawns something.
Got a hit on Caitlin's phone.
It showed that she had sold a phone at a kiosk at another Walmart in Independence that takes a picture of your ID, and it showed the date, the time that the transaction was made. There was surveillance video of her selling the phone with a person that did resemble very much the photo that Patrick had for his driver's license. He had cut his hair and shaved his face.
We were able to retrieve that phone. It was the phone that she had been using to communicate with Rodney the night of the murder.
We've gotten to a point where we've collected all the information. It's time to talk to them in regard to their role in the homicide of Rodney Thurber. I authored a court order for Patrick Powell's cellular device, and our tactical support squad found a residence where they thought the phone was at. It was tracked to Buckner, Missouri, which is about 30 miles east of Kansas City. They advised us, we have Patrick and Caitlin, they're in a vehicle, and we are about to try to stop the vehicle and take it into custody. Adrenaline is going. This is all going to come to a head. It was very exciting for us.
As the officers are following his car, it ends up parking at a Quick Trip. Two individuals get out of that car. A white female looking like Caitlin and a white male looking like Patrick. As they walk towards the door at the Quick Trip, officers move in, take them into custody.
Police inform Nadia of the arrests.
I was relieved. Everybody thought I'd shot him. Every relationship has problems, but I would never hurt him.
Investigators take Patrick Powell and Caitlin Riffle to the police department for questioning.
You've been read your rights. So, why don't you walk us through what happened?
I got nothing to say.
He almost had a smirk on his face. He knew he wasn't going to talk to me.
Patrick refuses to cooperate, so detectives press Caitlin for answers.
I don't know anything about anyone being killed.
Caitlin gives a statement to police and initially denies any involvement or any knowledge of what occurred.
Can I show you a couple pictures?
Yeah.
Okay.
They confront her with screenshots that show her at the McDonald's, show her text messages that occurred, and her story evolves.
Okay, he asked me where I left the gun, and
Who asked you where?
Patrick asked me where I left the gun, said he was going to go ask for it himself.
We finally got her to admit that they went and got the gun.
So when he comes running back to your car to get in, what did he say happened?
Nothing.
She was confronted with the fact that we had an eyewitness that says that she was in the apartment moments before the murder.
You see Caitlin today?
Yeah, she came to pick up the gun. He said after she gave the gun to you that it was a very short amount of time before there was a knock at the door.
I think I just we need a lawyer for any more questions.
Caitlin asked for a lawyer, and we end the interrogation.
Patrick and Caitlin are charged with first-degree murder. Both plead not guilty. At the trials, prosecutors step through the events that led to Rodney Thurber's murder.
The day of the homicide, Caitlin and Rodney had been texting. They had been texting about this gun. They were texting about her coming over and getting this gun. And we know the surveillance shows her car pull in that driveway. We know Nadia Cole says Caitlin came in that house, got that gun. We know that that silver car with Caitlin in the driver's seat and Amel in the passenger seat went through that McDonald's drive-thru.
Patrick walks to Rodney's home minutes later.
Patrick went over there on foot, by himself, armed with that handgun. He knew he was going to shoot Rodney.
The gun that we know Caitlin gave back to Patrick was a .380 handgun, the same caliber that matches the shell casings that were found at the scene. We know that individual ran away and ultimately got into that silver car that Caitlin was waiting for him to drive him away. Just 2 hours after the homicide, we catch them on the Walmart surveillance in that same silver BMW. Patrick wearing the same clothes with the fur on the coat, the pink shirt, and the green pants inside that Walmart.
The shoe print found at the crime scene matched neither suspect, but the pictures of the gun and the car that Caitlin sent to Rodney incriminated both her and Patrick. Stephanie Powell, the gun's legal owner, had no involvement in or knowledge of any criminal activity.
When trying to establish a motive in this case, we weren't exactly sure why.
Maybe Patrick's jealous of Rodney because of the relationship that he and Caitlin had previously.
I think he was trying to keep them two apart. He was jealous over the relationship that Rodney and Caitlin had.
It's clear from all the evidence that Nadia Cole was just an innocent bystander. She was a crucial witness for us in this case. Patrick Powell was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for murder in the first degree and 10 years for armed criminal action. Caitlin Riffle was sentenced to 20 years for murder in the second degree and 3 years for armed criminal action. This murder wouldn't have occurred but for her actions. She was the getaway driver. She's the one that provided the murder weapon. But ultimately, she's not the one that pulled the trigger. Without the surveillance in this case, we'd have been left with just names. We would not have been able to put our suspects together in the moments after the homicide.
I never said goodbye to Rodney, and I'm not going to. But I still talk to him. He's still a part of me. He's still a part of my life. I'll miss Rodney's smile and the way he made people feel. He was a great man that loved helping others.
Next time on See No Evil.
My sister has been missing for almost 5 days now.
There was more to this than just a missing persons case.
We're certain that some type of foul play has been involved.
We knew that they were lying because of the CCTV.
30 years can turn a murder investigation into a forgotten file, a name into a photograph fading inside a box, and a child's final journey into a question that refuses to disappear. But in Fort Wayne, Indiana, one question remained painfully alive. Who killed 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley? On April 1st, 1988, April disappeared after leaving school in Fort Wayne. She never made it home. 3 days later, on April 4th, her body was discovered in a ditch along County Road 68 in southeastern DeKalb County. The little girl who had vanished from her neighborhood was suddenly at the center of a homicide investigation that would haunt the region for decades. The case began with the terrible simplicity that defines so many missing child investigations. A child leaves. A family waits. The minutes become hours. The hours become panic. Then the search becomes something far darker. In April's case, the distance between disappearance and discovery was only a few days. But what investigators found would create a mystery that remained unresolved for nearly 3 decades. There was no immediate answer, no obvious killer, no confession waiting around the corner. Instead, detectives faced the devastating reality that an 8-year-old girl had been taken from her ordinary life and murdered, while the person responsible remained somewhere beyond the reach of the investigation. Fort Wayne was a community where people knew their neighborhoods, their streets, their routine. The disappearance of a child could not simply become another story in the background. It demanded attention. It demanded answers. And yet, the first hours of the investigation offered something investigators hate most: uncertainty. April had not simply wandered away and been found safe. She was dead. Her body had been left in a rural area outside the city, creating an immediate and disturbing question about how she had gotten there and who had taken her. Every detail mattered. Every possible witness mattered. Every movement in the days surrounding her disappearance had to be examined. But time was already moving. The killer had a head start. Investigators had to reconstruct the final hours of a child whose voice could no longer guide them. That meant relying on people who had seen her, places she had visited, records that could establish movements, and physical evidence that might have survived the crime. The investigation would eventually become one of Indiana's most notorious cold cases, but at that moment, it was painfully current. April was not a historical figure. She was a missing child. Her family was waiting for information. Detectives were searching for the person responsible. The community wanted to know whether the danger was still present. And somewhere, the person who knew what had happened was silent. The discovery of April's body transformed the investigation immediately. What had begun as a disappearance became a homicide. The search for a missing child became a search for a killer. Investigators had to work backward. Where had April been? Who had seen her? How had she disappeared? What route had she taken? Who could have approached her without attracting attention? What happened between the moment she vanished and the moment her body was found? These questions were not abstract. They were the foundation of the case. Every answer could potentially lead to another question, and every unanswered question created another shadow around the investigation. The rural location where April was found added another layer of mystery. She had disappeared from Fort Wayne, yet her body was discovered in southeastern DeKalb County. That meant investigators had to consider movement across jurisdictions and determine how the victim had traveled from one place to another. The location was significant because it separated the last known moments of April's life from the place where the investigation discovered her. Somewhere between those points was a sequence of events that only the killer knew. The case became a search for that missing sequence. Investigators collected evidence. They interviewed people. They followed leads. They tried to determine whether anyone had seen April after she left school. They looked for anything that could identify the person responsible. But the investigation did not produce an immediate breakthrough. Instead, the years began accumulating. 1 year became 2. 2 became 5. 5 became 10, and the case remained open. April's name continued to exist inside police records while the identity of her killer remained unknown. The passage of time created new obstacles. Memories faded. People moved. Investigators changed. Technology evolved. A detective who had worked the case in the 1980s might eventually retire, leaving another investigator to inherit the file. The original physical evidence remained important, but new forensic techniques began changing what investigators could potentially learn from old material. That transformation would become crucial later, but for years there was no miracle, no sudden confession, no dramatic arrest. The case simply remained there, waiting. April's murder became what investigators call a cold case, but the word cold can be misleading. A cold case is not necessarily forgotten. It can remain active in the minds of detectives and families even when there are no new developments. In April's case, the investigation continued to haunt the community. Indiana authorities later described the murder as an unsolved homicide, recording that April had been missing from her Fort Wayne neighborhood since the afternoon of April 1, 1988, when she failed to arrive home from school. That single sentence contains the beginning of an enormous tragedy. She left school. She should have gone home. She never arrived. Somewhere along that ordinary journey, everything changed. And because she never came home, investigators spent decades trying to understand what happened next. The case eventually became so deeply embedded in Fort Wayne's memory that authorities still described it years later as a case that had haunted the community for 3 decades. In a 2009 report, the Fort Wayne Police Department noted that a media campaign had been launched to help solve the 20-year-old murder of 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley. The campaign generated more than 100 new leads, and dozens of DNA samples were collected. That detail reveals just how far the investigation had traveled. 20 years after the murder, police were still asking the public to remember, still searching, still hoping that one person might know something that could break the case open. The response showed that April's murder had not disappeared from public consciousness. People were still willing to provide information, investigators were still willing to reopen questions, and forensic science was beginning to offer possibilities that had not existed when April was killed. DNA had already transformed criminal investigations across the United States, but its power in older cases depended on something crucial: preserved biological evidence. If investigators could recover a usable DNA profile from evidence connected to the crime, they might be able to compare it against known profiles. If a match existed, the case could change instantly. If there was no match, however, the profile could remain anonymous. That was the situation facing many cold cases. The science could identify a biological signature without identifying the person behind it. The evidence could say, in effect, this is the same person, but not tell investigators who that person was. April's case would eventually become a striking example of how that problem could be overcome. But first came years of frustration. The investigation generated leads, but leads are not answers. A tip can point in a direction without proving anything. A suspect can appear promising and then disappear from consideration. A witness can remember a detail that seems important only to discover that it cannot be independently confirmed. Detectives must separate what is possible from what is provable. In a case involving a murdered child, that distinction can be agonizing. Families want answers immediately. Investigators need evidence strong enough to survive scrutiny, and the longer the case remains unsolved, the more difficult that balance becomes. Yet April's case never completely vanished. Her name remained attached to the investigation. The search for her killer continued through changing generations of law enforcement, and somewhere in the evidence was a clue that had not yet revealed its full importance. The eventual breakthrough would not come from a dramatic eyewitness stepping forward decades later. It would come from a scientific method that investigators of 1988 could not have imagined. But before that future could arrive, the case had to survive the years between the crime and the breakthrough. That meant preserving evidence, re-examining old information, keeping the investigation alive, and refusing to accept that the passage of time meant the truth was gone. 30 years after April's death, investigators would finally stand on the edge of an answer. But on that April afternoon in 1988, none of that future was visible. There was only a missing child, a family waiting for her return, a community searching for answers, and a killer who believed the silence would protect him. The silence would last for decades, but it would not last forever. For investigators, the first days after April Tinsley's disappearance were not a story of a cold case. There was nothing cold about it. There was a child who had vanished, a family desperate for answers, and a community trying to understand how an 8-year-old girl could leave school and never make it home. Every hour mattered. Every possible sighting had to be examined. Every person who might have crossed April's path became potentially important. But the investigation was already facing the cruelest problem in any disappearance. The person who knew what had happened had a head start. April had disappeared on April 1st, 1988, after leaving school in Fort Wayne. 3 days later, her body was discovered in a rural area of DeKalb County. The geography alone forced investigators to reconstruct a journey they could not witness. Somewhere between the familiar world of April's school and the isolated place where she was found was the missing story. That story had to be recovered piece by piece. The investigators could not ask April what she had seen. They could only ask the people around her, examine the available evidence, and search for inconsistencies that might reveal what had happened. Her death turned the entire investigation toward one central question: who had taken her? The answer did not come quickly, and as the initial search expanded, investigators faced another reality that would define the case for decades. There was no obvious suspect, no immediate confession, no single piece of evidence that pointed directly to a killer. Instead, there was uncertainty. A little girl was dead, and the person responsible had disappeared into that uncertainty. In the years that followed, investigators would continue working the case. The Fort Wayne Police Department and other authorities did not simply place April's name in a drawer and walk away. The investigation remained alive. In fact, decades later, officials would emphasize just how much effort had continued behind the scenes. The Indiana Prosecuting Attorneys Council later recognized Fort Wayne Deputy Chief Gary Hamilton for his role in helping a task force solve the 30-year-old case, describing the investigation as one that had haunted the community for 3 decades. That phrase captures something important about the case. 30 years had passed, but the investigation had never truly disappeared. It had simply entered a different phase. The first phase was frantic. Detectives needed immediate answers. The second phase was relentless. Leads were pursued, evidence was examined, and investigators attempted to identify the person responsible. The third phase was the most difficult of all, waiting for technology to make possible what conventional investigation could not. But before the technology arrived, there were years of questions. Who had seen April after she left school? Had anyone noticed a suspicious vehicle? Had anyone noticed someone behaving strangely around the neighborhood? Could a seemingly insignificant observation become important years later? These were the questions that surrounded the investigation. In a case involving a child, investigators also had to consider the possibility that the offender had been able to approach April without immediately appearing dangerous. That made the search even more difficult. A stranger could be noticed. Someone who seemed familiar might not be. The investigators had to consider every possibility without knowing which one mattered. And while detectives worked, April's family lived with an unbearable absence. The ordinary rhythm of life had been shattered. There would be no simple explanation for why April did not come home. There would be no moment when the family could simply close the door on the event and return to normal. Her name became permanently connected to the unanswered question. As the years passed, the case became a reminder of how brutally time can change an investigation. The witnesses who remembered the first days grew older. Investigators moved into other assignments. New detectives inherited the files. The community changed. Streets changed. Technology changed. But the evidence associated with April remained part of the case. That evidence would eventually become the most important character in the story. It did not speak. It did not move. It simply waited. The investigators needed a way to make it useful, and that possibility became increasingly realistic as forensic science advanced. DNA profiling had transformed criminal investigations during the years after April's murder. What had once been invisible biological material could now potentially become a genetic identifier. But having DNA was not the same as having a name. A profile could establish that biological material came from a particular individual, but if that individual was not already known to law enforcement, the profile could remain anonymous. That distinction became critical. The investigation could possess a biological signature without knowing whose signature it was. The killer could therefore remain unidentified even when science had something extremely personal about him. This was the strange position investigators eventually found themselves in. The evidence could point to the same unknown person, but it could not yet tell them who that person was. The case became a race between time and technology. Every year that passed seemed to make the human investigation hard, but every year also brought new scientific possibilities. The question slowly changed. Investigators were no longer asking only, who could have done this? They were asking, what can modern science tell us about the person who left this evidence behind? That shift would become decisive. Yet the breakthrough was still years away. For a long time, the case remained unresolved. In 2009, 21 years after April's murder, the Fort Wayne Police Department launched a media campaign surrounding the case. The effort generated more than 100 new leads, and dozens of DNA samples were collected. Imagine what that meant for investigators. More than 2 decades after the murder, the case was still capable of generating new information. People were still talking. People were still remembering. People were still willing to provide DNA samples. The investigation had not become irrelevant. It had become unfinished. That distinction mattered. A cold case is often portrayed as a case where everything has stopped. But April's case demonstrated another reality. Sometimes investigators continue moving even when the public sees no progress. A lead may take weeks to examine. A sample may eliminate a person rather than identify the killer. A new tip may confirm something investigators already suspected. Progress can be invisible because most investigative work produces no dramatic headline. Yet all of it mattered. The hundreds of leads generated by the renewed publicity did not immediately produce the answer, but they helped keep the case alive. The DNA collection was particularly important because it created opportunities to compare biological evidence against people who might have been considered in the investigation. If a person could be excluded, investigators could eliminate one possibility. If someone matched, the entire case could change. But the right match did not appear. The killer remained unknown. The years continued. 20 years became 25. 25 became 30. And the question remained. By the time the case approached its 3rd decade, the phrase cold case seemed almost permanent. April had been dead for years longer than she had been alive. The world around the investigation had changed dramatically. Phones had changed. Computers had changed. DNA technology had changed. Investigative databases had changed. Yet the fundamental question had not changed at all. Who killed April Tinsley? The answer was still hidden. Then something happened that would alter the case forever. A new generation of investigators began looking at the evidence through a modern forensic lens. They were no longer limited to the methods available in 1988. The old evidence could now be reconsidered with technology that had not existed when April was killed. And this time, investigators were not simply searching for a name in a conventional database. They were looking for a way to use genetic information differently. The science of forensic genealogy was beginning to transform cold case investigations around the country. Instead of requiring an exact DNA match to a known offender, investigators could potentially use genetic relationships to narrow the search. That concept was revolutionary because it changed the direction of the investigation. The killer's DNA did not need to already belong to a known suspect. It might be possible to follow genetic connections through relatives and eventually reach the person who had remained unidentified. The method was still developing, and it raised difficult questions about privacy and investigative boundaries, but its potential was enormous. April's case was about to enter that new era. For nearly 30 years, the investigation had been moving through darkness, searching for a clue strong enough to identify the person responsible. Now, the evidence that had remained silent for decades was approaching the moment when it could finally speak. The killer had survived the passage of time because no one knew his name. But time had also created the technology that could expose him, and somewhere inside the old evidence was a genetic trail leading toward a person who had spent decades believing the crime would remain unsolved. The trail was still incomplete. The name was still unknown. But for the first time, the investigation was no longer standing still. The case was beginning to move. For nearly 3 decades, the murder of April Tinsley remained trapped between two worlds. In one world, investigators knew exactly what had happened to a little girl. In the other, they could not identify the person responsible. The evidence existed, but the name did not. That gap became the defining feature of the investigation. Every new lead had to cross it. Every new forensic technique had to cross it. Every detective who opened the case files eventually faced the same wall. How do you identify a killer whose DNA is known, but whose identity is not? By the middle of the 2010s, forensic science was changing the answer. Investigators were beginning to understand that DNA did not have to produce an exact match to be useful. Genetic information could reveal relationships. Relationships could reveal families. Families could reveal individuals. The idea was still unfamiliar to much of the public, but for investigators working on long, unsolved cases, it represented a completely new direction. April's case was about to become one of the most extraordinary examples of that approach. The investigation had already established that biological evidence connected the offender to the crime. What investigators needed was a bridge from that evidence to a human name. Traditional law enforcement databases had not provided the answer. The unknown DNA profile remained unknown. That meant investigators had to think differently. Instead of asking whether the killer himself appeared in a database, they could ask whether someone related to him might appear there. The distinction was enormous. A criminal could avoid police databases. He could live decades without being arrested. He could remain outside the traditional systems used to identify suspects. But he could not choose his relatives. His genetic connections existed whether he wanted them to or not. Those connections could potentially become the map investigators needed. In April's case, the investigation eventually reached out toward forensic genetic genealogy. The technique involved comparing an unknown forensic DNA profile with genetic information used for genealogical research and then building family relationships from the resulting matches. It required sophisticated analysis and traditional genealogical work. The objective was not to simply find a name and declare the case solved. The objective was to create a lead. Once investigators had a possible family line, they could narrow the field by examining age, location, relationships, and other identifying information. Then they could investigate potential suspects through conventional methods and, most importantly, compare their DNA directly with the crime scene evidence. That distinction would become essential. Genetic genealogy could point investigators toward a person. It could not replace the need for direct forensic confirmation. The process began producing possibilities. Investigators examined family connections and traced branches through generations. The work required patience because the relevant genetic relationship might be distant. A match could point toward a family rather than an individual. That family could contain numerous people, many of whom had nothing to do with the crime. Investigators therefore had to eliminate people who did not fit. The suspect had to be the right age. He had to have a plausible connection to the region. His history had to make sense within the timeline. Every step narrowed the search. It was detective work transformed by genetics. For decades, investigators had been trying to move from the crime to the killer. Now they were moving through the killer's family tree toward the crime. The direction was reversed, and that reversal was what made the breakthrough possible. As investigators worked through the genetic information, one name eventually emerged as a person of interest: John D. He was a Fort Wayne area resident whose background made him worth examining. But a name alone was not enough. Investigators needed evidence. They needed to know whether Miller was actually connected to the DNA associated with April's murder. That required a direct comparison. The investigation then moved from genealogy to surveillance and traditional police work. Investigators obtained DNA associated with Miller and compared it with the forensic evidence. The result was decisive. Authorities determined that Miller's DNA matched the DNA profile associated with the killer. The case that had remained unresolved since 1988 had suddenly acquired a suspect whose biological evidence connected him directly to the investigation. In July 2018, authorities arrested John D. Miller in Fort Wayne. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community. 30 years after April Tinsley's murder, investigators finally had a name. The little girl whose case had remained one of Indiana's most painful cold cases was no longer attached to an unknown offender. The investigation had reached a person, but the arrest was only the beginning of the final chapter. Investigators now had to examine Miller's background, the evidence, and the circumstances surrounding the crime. They had to establish what could be proven in court, and the public had to confront an extraordinary fact. The person accused of killing April had lived in the same broad community for decades. The mystery had not been solved by finding a stranger in another state. It had been solved by identifying a man whose life had unfolded while the case remained unsolved. That realization was difficult for many people to absorb. For decades, the killer had been an unknown figure. Now the community had a name and a face. The investigation had crossed from speculation into accusation, but the strongest evidence was scientific. The DNA connection gave investigators what they had been missing for 30 years. It did not rely on a memory from 1988. It did not depend on a witness recognizing someone after decades. It was a biological link. That was why the breakthrough was so powerful. Human memory changes. DNA does not forget. The evidence collected decades earlier had survived long enough for technology to transform it into an identification. The case demonstrated the extraordinary value of preserving forensic evidence, even when investigators do not know when or how it will eventually be used. In 1988, investigators could not have predicted genetic genealogy. They could not have known that decades later, researchers would be able to analyze genetic relationships in ways that could lead toward an unidentified suspect. But the evidence remained. And because it remained, the future had something to work with. That is one of the most important lessons of cold case investigations. The breakthrough may not exist yet. The technology may not exist yet. The database may not exist yet. But evidence collected today may still matter tomorrow. April's case proved that principle with extraordinary force. For 30 years, the investigation had seemed trapped in the past. Then science created a bridge to the present. The arrest also brought renewed attention to April herself. For years, her name had appeared in cold case lists and investigative appeals. Her photograph reminded the public that behind the case number was a little girl who had been 8 years old when her life ended. She was not simply a mystery. She was a daughter. She was a child who had gone to school and expected to return home. The passage of 30 years could never change that. The arrest of Miller could not restore the life that had been taken from her, but it could answer one of the most painful questions her family and community had carried. Who was responsible? That answer had been hidden for nearly 3 decades. Now it was out, and with the arrest came a new kind of uncertainty. Would the evidence hold? Would the case go to trial? Would Miller admit responsibility? Would prosecutors be able to establish what happened in 1988? The public had waited 30 years for a name. Now everyone had to wait for the legal process to determine what would happen next. But the breakthrough itself was extraordinary. A case that had survived 3 decades had been cracked through a combination of preserved DNA, genetic genealogy, and traditional police investigation. The technology had not replaced detectives. It had given them a new direction. The investigators still had to follow the lead. They still had to confirm the suspect. They still had to build the case. But without the genetic connection, they might never have reached Miller. The murder of April Tinsley had entered a new era. The cold case was no longer cold. The question had changed from who killed April to what can the evidence now tell us about the man investigators have identified? That question carried enormous weight because an arrest does not automatically reveal the entire truth. It creates a legal process in which evidence must be tested, challenged, and established. For April's family, however, one thing had already changed forever. After 30 years of uncertainty, they finally knew the name of the man accused of taking her life. The silence had been broken. The mystery had a face. And somewhere inside that face was the story investigators had spent decades trying to uncover. The arrest of John D. Miller did not come from a sudden confession appearing out of nowhere. It came from a trail that had been forming quietly for years, and at the center of that trail was something the killer had never been able to take back: his DNA. For 30 years, April Tinsley's murder had existed in the space between certainty and identity. Investigators knew a crime had occurred. They had biological evidence. They had searched. They had followed leads. They had asked the public for help, but the person responsible remained unknown. Then genetic genealogy changed the direction of the investigation. The technique allowed investigators working with Parabon, nanolabs, and genealogist Cease Moore to use the unidentified DNA profile in a completely different way. Rather than waiting for the killer himself to appear in a conventional law enforcement database, investigators searched for genetic relatives. The search produced a family connection. From there, Moore worked backward through a family tree, narrowing the possibilities until investigators were looking at two brothers. One of them was John Miller. The other was no longer the primary focus. The decades-old mystery had suddenly narrowed to a handful of possibilities. But investigators still needed to be certain. A genealogical lead was not enough. A family connection was not enough. The person standing at the end of the family tree had to be tested against the actual forensic evidence. That is where traditional police work returned to the center of the story. Investigators began watching Miller. They needed to obtain his DNA without alerting him to the investigation. According to the probable cause affidavit, detectives eventually recovered used condoms from trash associated with Miller's residence and submitted the material for comparison. The result was devastatingly clear. The DNA profile was consistent with the biological evidence recovered from April Tinsley and with evidence associated with later threatening communications connected to the case. The genetic trail had led investigators to a family. The direct DNA comparison led them to a man. 30 years after April vanished, the investigation finally had the evidence needed to move. But there was another disturbing layer to the story. The killer had apparently not remained completely silent during those decades. Investigators had received threatening communications that claimed responsibility for April's murder and suggested the offender might strike again. In 2004, notes were reportedly left at homes in the Fort Wayne area, accompanied by used condoms and photographs with messages claiming to be from the person who had kidnapped and killed April. For investigators, those communications created a chilling problem. Were they authentic? Were they written by April's killer? Were they deliberate attempts to provoke police? Or were they the work of someone else exploiting a notorious unsolved murder? Every possibility had to be considered, but the biological material associated with those communications eventually became significant because investigators were able to compare it with the DNA connected to April's case. The connection strengthened the investigation. It suggested that the person behind the later messages could be the same person responsible for April's murder. And if that person was still alive, investigators now had a way to find him. The breakthrough came in the summer of 2018. Detectives approached Miller outside his residence on July 15th. According to the affidavit, they asked whether he knew why police wanted to speak with him. His response was startling. He said, "April Tinsley, that moment transformed the atmosphere of the investigation." For 30 years, April's name had been spoken by detectives, family members, reporters, and people who remembered the case. Now, the man investigators believed was responsible was saying her name himself. Detectives told Miller they had a DNA match. They asked him to explain what had happened. According to the affidavit, Miller admitted that he had abducted April on April 1st, 1988. He described taking her to his trailer, sexually assaulting her, and killing her. He told investigators that he had strangled her and later transported her body to the location where it was discovered. The confession provided investigators with something they had not possessed for 3 decades: the account of the man they believed had committed the crime. But the confession did not replace the DNA evidence. It reinforced it. The case now contained multiple layers of evidence pointing in the same direction. Genetic genealogy had identified a potential family. Direct DNA testing had connected Miller to the forensic profile, and Miller's own statements connected him to April's disappearance and death. The investigation that had once been defined uncertainty had suddenly become extraordinarily focused. In July 2018, authorities announced Miller's arrest. He was 59 years old. The case that had begun when he was a young man was now bringing him into custody as an older adult. The news traveled rapidly through Fort Wayne. For people who had followed April's case for years, the arrest was almost difficult to believe. 30 years had passed. 30 years of photographs. 30 years of questions. 30 years of wondering whether the person responsible would ever be identified. And suddenly, there was a name. John Miller. The case was no longer an unknown homicide. It had a suspect. But the arrest also created another wave of questions. Who was Miller? How had he escaped suspicion for so long? Had he been living in the area all those years? Had investigators ever encountered him during the original investigation? And most importantly, why had the evidence taken 30 years to reveal his identity? The answer was partly technological. In 1988, investigators did not have the tools that eventually became available. Genetic genealogy would have been unimaginable to detectives working the original case. The ability to upload a forensic profile and search for distant genetic relationships belonged to a completely different era. The investigation had not suddenly become smarter. The tools had become more powerful. That distinction is critical because it explains why April's case remained unsolved for so long despite the efforts of investigators. The evidence had existed. What was missing was the method. Once the method appeared, the old evidence became a roadmap. The arrest became one of the earliest major examples of investigative genetic genealogy leading to a conviction. The technique had gained national attention earlier in 2018 after investigators used it to identify Joseph DiNgello, the Golden State Killer investigation. But April Tinsley's case demonstrated that the same approach could reach another kind of mystery. A child murdered in a Midwestern community decades earlier with an offender whose identity had remained hidden despite years of investigation. The implications were enormous. If April's killer could be identified through distant relatives, then other unknown offenders might also be vulnerable to the same method. Cold cases, once considered nearly impossible, could potentially be reopened. Biological evidence that had sat untouched for decades could suddenly become the most important clue in the entire file. But the investigators still had to face the legal process. Miller was charged with murder, child molestation, and criminal confinement. At an initial hearing, he pleaded not guilty. The case appeared headed toward a trial that could force the details of April's final hours into public view. For April's family, that possibility carried enormous emotional weight. A trial could provide answers, but it could also require them to hear painful details of what had happened. The family had already waited 30 years. Now they faced another difficult decision: pursue a full trial or accept a plea agreement that would guarantee a long prison sentence. The prosecution ultimately reached an agreement with Miller. On December 7, 2018, he changed his plea to guilty. He admitted responsibility for the crimes, bringing the case to a legal conclusion without a lengthy jury trial. The sentence followed later that month. Miller received 80 years in prison, with 50 years for murder and 30 years for child molestation. For April's family, the number 80 could never equal what had been lost. No sentence could restore the life of an 8-year-old girl. No courtroom could return the years that had passed. No scientific breakthrough could erase the grief that began in 1988. But the sentence meant something important. The man responsible had been identified. He had admitted guilt, and he would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. After 30 years, the case had reached its answer. Yet the most extraordinary part of the story was not the sentence. It was the path that led there. A little girl disappeared in 1988. Evidence was collected. The case went cold. Investigators kept searching. DNA technology advanced. Genetic genealogy emerged. A distant family connection appeared. Investigators narrowed the family tree. 2 brothers became the focus. 1 man became the suspect. His discarded DNA was tested. The match came back. Detectives approached him. He said April's name. Then he confessed. The entire sequence seemed almost impossible when viewed from the beginning. In 1988, there was no way for investigators to know that the answer would eventually emerge from a genetic family tree. They could not know that consumer genealogy databases would become widespread. They could not know that scientists would develop methods for connecting anonymous DNA profiles to distant relatives. They could only preserve the evidence and keep the investigation alive. That decision mattered because 30 years later, the future finally arrived. The case had not been solved because the past suddenly changed. It was solved because the present had finally become capable of understanding the past. April's DNA had waited. The evidence had waited. The investigation had waited. And when the right technology appeared, the silence began to break. But one final question remained hanging over the entire story. If the killer had been able to remain unidentified for 30 years, what had he been doing during all that time? Had he truly believed the case would never be solved? Had he watched news reports about April? Had he seen investigators reopen the case? Had he followed the publicity campaigns? Had he realized that the evidence was getting close? And when detectives finally came to his door, did he understand immediately that the 30-year silence was over? His first response suggested that he did. When asked why police wanted to speak with him, he said April Tinsley. 3 words, a name that had haunted Fort Wayne for decades, a name that investigators had carried through mountains of evidence and years of frustration, a name that the killer himself apparently recognized instantly. The mystery that had survived 30 years had finally reached the man at its center. And now, for the first time, investigators could ask him the question that had remained unanswered since 1988. What happened to April Tinsley? The question that had remained unanswered for 30 years was finally being answered by the man investigators believed had carried it with him all that time. But even after John Miller was identified, the full weight of the April Tinsley case was only beginning to settle over Fort Wayne. For 3 decades, April's murder had existed as an open wound in the community. Her name had appeared in newspaper stories, police appeals, anniversary reports, and cold case investigations. Her photograph had become a reminder of a crime that had refused to disappear. Now suddenly, the person responsible had been identified, arrested, and charged. The investigation had moved from uncertainty to prosecution with astonishing speed. But for April's family, the emotional journey was much more complicated. An arrest could answer who. It could not answer every question about why. It could not restore the childhood that had been taken away. It could not return the years that had passed without justice. And it could not erase the memory of the day April failed to come home. The legal system, however, had to move forward. Miller faced charges connected to April's death, including murder, child molestation, and criminal confinement. The evidence against him was unusually strong for a case that had remained unsolved for so long. Investigators had the original forensic evidence. They had the genetic genealogy investigation that had led them to Miller's family. They had the subsequent direct DNA comparison, and according to the probable cause affidavit, they had statements Miller made to investigators after his arrest. The case no longer depended on a single uncertain clue. Several investigative paths had converged on the same person. That convergence was what transformed a 30-year mystery into a prosecutable case. Yet the defense of any criminal defendant remains a fundamental part of the legal system. Miller initially pleaded not guilty. That meant the prosecution still had to proceed according to law. Investigators could believe they had solved the case, but belief was not enough. Evidence had to be presented. Charges had to be established. The court had to determine the legal outcome. For the public, however, the arrest had already produced an extraordinary realization. The man accused of killing April had not been found through a new eyewitness or a confession suddenly appearing in the newspaper. He had been reached through his genetic history. His family tree had become the bridge between an anonymous DNA profile and a living suspect. That method represented a dramatic change in cold case investigation. In the past, detectives searching for an unknown offender often had only a few options. They could compare DNA to law enforcement databases. They could question suspects. They could seek witnesses. They could hope for a confession. But if none of those methods produced an identification, the case could remain unresolved indefinitely. Genetic genealogy changed that equation. It created another path. The path was indirect, but it could be extraordinarily powerful. The unknown DNA did not have to belong to a person already known to investigators. A relative could provide the first connection. That connection could lead to another relative. Another could lead to a family branch. Eventually, investigators could narrow the possibilities until only a small number of people remained. Then traditional investigation could take over. That is essentially what happened in April's case. The science did not simply point to Miller and end the investigation. It gave detectives a direction. They still had to verify the lead. They still had to establish that Miller's DNA matched the forensic evidence. They still had to investigate his history. They still had to build a case strong enough to withstand legal scrutiny. The process demonstrated why forensic genealogy is best understood as an investigative tool rather than a substitute for investigation. The technology opened the door. Detectives still had to walk through it. The implications extended far beyond April's murder. In 2008, investigators across the United States were beginning to recognize the potential of genetic genealogy. Several high-profile cold cases had suddenly been cracked using the method. The concept was capturing national attention because it appeared to offer something traditional DNA databases could not: a way to identify an unknown person through distant relatives. April Tinsley's case became part of that transformation. It showed that the technique could reach a case involving a child whose killer had remained unidentified for 3 decades. The timing was significant. April's murder had occurred in 1988, long before consumer genealogy databases became part of everyday life. The detectives who originally investigated the crime could never have predicted that people decades later would voluntarily submit genetic information to learn about their ancestry. Yet that information would eventually become part of the investigative landscape. The science had created an unexpected intersection between genealogy and criminal justice. The implications were profound. A person could submit DNA to learn about their family history, never imagining that a distant genetic connection might someday help investigators identify a criminal suspect. That possibility generated enthusiasm among families desperate for answers, but it also raised serious privacy questions. How should law enforcement use genetic databases? What safeguards should exist? What types of crimes should qualify? How should investigators ensure that innocent relatives are not treated as suspects simply because they share DNA with someone who is? These questions would become increasingly important as the technique spread, but in Fort Wayne, the immediate issue was much more personal. April had been 8 years old when she died. The passage of 30 years meant that many people who had known her were now living in a completely different stage of life. Children who had attended school with her had become adults. Detectives who had worked the original investigation had retired. The community itself had changed, yet the murder remained. That was one of the most painful features of a cold case. The world moves forward even when one question does not. People grow older, families change, neighborhoods transform, technology advances, but the unanswered question stays exactly where it was. In April's case, the question was eventually carried into a courtroom, and there, the focus shifted from discovery to accountability. Miller's decision to plead guilty meant that the case would not require a lengthy jury trial. On December 7, 2018, he pleaded guilty to the charges connected with April's murder. The guilty plea provided a legal acknowledgement of responsibility and allowed the case to move towards sentencing. For investigators who had spent years working the case, it represented the end of an extraordinary journey. For April's family, it was something far more complicated. A guilty plea could provide certainty, but certainty does not automatically produce peace. The truth can hurt even when it is desperately wanted. For 30 years, there had been questions about what happened to April. Now, some of those questions had answers, but answers can carry their own weight. The details of the crime were no longer unknown. The identity of the offender was no longer unknown. The family no longer had to wonder whether the person responsible would ever be identified. That uncertainty had finally ended. The sentencing became the final legal stage. Miller was sentenced to 80 years in prison, with 50 years for murder and 30 years for child molestation. The sentence reflected the seriousness of the crimes and ensured that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But even 80 years could not measure the loss represented by April's death. A sentence counts prison time. It cannot count birthdays that never happened. It cannot count school years that were never lived. It cannot count the moments a family spent wondering what their daughter might have become. That is the cruel arithmetic of homicide. The justice system can punish the person responsible, but it cannot reverse the event. April would always remain 8 years old. The people who loved her would continue carrying the memory of the child she was. The case could be closed legally, but it could never be rewritten. And yet, there was something profoundly significant about the fact that the case had been solved at all. For decades, April's murder had represented the limits of investigation. Then those limits moved. The evidence that had once seemed incapable of identifying the killer became decisive. A genetic relationship that had not existed in any investigative database when April was alive became the first step toward identifying her murderer. The case showed that cold cases are not necessarily dead cases. Sometimes they are waiting for a scientific breakthrough. Sometimes they are waiting for a new investigator to ask a different question. Sometimes they are waiting for technology to catch up with evidence that has been sitting silently for years. April's case had all three. The evidence survived. Investigators persisted. Technology changed, and eventually the three forces came together. That was why the breakthrough felt so sudden, even though it had been decades in the making. The arrest happened in 2018. The guilty plea came later that same year. The sentence followed. To someone watching from the outside, the case appeared to move from mystery to resolution almost overnight. But the real investigation had been unfolding since 1988. Every report mattered. Every preserved sample mattered. Every investigator who refused to abandon the case mattered. The people who kept April's name alive mattered. Without those earlier efforts, the technology of the future would have had nothing to reveal. The breakthrough was therefore not simply a triumph of modern genetics. It was also a triumph of persistence. A case that survived 30 years required people willing to keep believing that an answer might still exist. And when the answer finally came, it carried the name John D. Miller. But even then, another question remained. How had a man connected to such a horrific crime remained unidentified for so long? How had the investigation passed through decades without reaching him? And what did his identification reveal about the limits of traditional policing? Those questions would become part of April Tinsley's lasting legacy. Her murder was solved, but the case exposed something larger about unsolved crime. Sometimes the truth is not missing. Sometimes it is simply hidden behind a wall that investigators do not yet know how to cross. For April, that wall stood for 30 years. Then, almost without warning, science found a door. And when investigators opened it, the name waiting on the other side changed everything. For 30 years, the name April Tinsley remained attached to a question that seemed impossible to answer. But the investigation that finally identified her killer revealed that the most important clue had never disappeared. It had been waiting inside the evidence. The DNA profile associated with the offender had survived the passage of time, even as the world around the investigation changed. That fact became the foundation of everything that followed. In the years after April's murder, investigators had repeatedly tried to determine who could have committed the crime. But the unknown biological profile remained exactly that, unknown. It could tell investigators that the same individual was connected to evidence from the crime and later communications, but it could not provide a name. Conventional forensic databases did not produce the identification investigators needed. The case, therefore, remained suspended between certainty and mystery. There was no doubt that April had been murdered. There was no doubt that biological evidence connected the offender to the investigation. But there was still no answer to the most important question. Who was he? The breakthrough came when investigators began using investigative genetic genealogy. The approach changed the direction of the search. Instead of looking only for a direct match, investigators searched for genetic relatives connected to the unknown profile. A relative could be many steps removed from the person who committed the crime. That meant the investigation could not simply look at a single name and declare victory. It required a reconstruction of family relationships. Genealogical research became part of criminal investigation. The work was painstaking. A genetic match might point toward an extended family containing dozens or even hundreds of people. Investigators had to determine which branches mattered. They had to trace relationships through records. They had to establish where people had lived and whether their ages and histories were consistent with the investigation. They had to separate coincidence from meaningful connection. Every branch of the family tree created another possibility, and every possibility had to be tested. The process eventually narrowed the investigation toward the Miller family. John D. Miller emerged as a person investigators needed to examine closely, but the genetic genealogy itself was not the final proof. It was a lead. That distinction became essential because the power of the method depended on investigators following traditional forensic procedures afterward. Detectives needed to obtain Miller's DNA and compare it directly with the forensic evidence from April's case. They eventually recovered biological material associated with Miller and sent it for testing. The resulting comparison provided the connection investigators had been searching for since 1988. The DNA match, the anonymous biological profile, had finally been attached to a living person, and suddenly 30 years of uncertainty began collapsing. The investigation now had a name, a face, and a direct forensic connection. But the case contained another disturbing element. The person investigators had identified was not simply someone who appeared unexpectedly in the final stages of the investigation. According to investigators, Miller had been connected to a series of communications that had kept April's case alive in the public consciousness. Those communications were deeply disturbing. They appeared to come from someone claiming knowledge of April's murder and included biological material that investigators could later analyze. The messages had been sent years after April's death, meaning that someone was deliberately drawing attention back to a crime that had never been solved. For investigators, that created a complicated situation. Was the writer genuinely connected to the murder? Was someone trying to manipulate the investigation? Could the biological material provide an answer? Those questions remained open until forensic testing created the connection. The DNA associated with the later communications matched the DNA linked to April's murder. That meant the communications were no longer simply disturbing pieces of evidence. They had become potential links to the offender himself. The person behind them was apparently the same person whose biological evidence had been preserved from the original investigation. And now investigators had a way to identify him. The genetic genealogy investigation provided the route. The DNA comparison provided confirmation. The communications provided another layer of evidence connecting the unknown offender to the case. Investigators now had a coherent picture that had been impossible for decades. In July 2018, police arrested Miller in Fort Wayne. The arrest itself carried an almost surreal quality. The case had begun in a different era. When April disappeared, personal computers were not part of ordinary daily life. There were no smartphones. There were no social media platforms. DNA profiling was in its early development. Investigators had relied on interviews, photographs, physical evidence, handwritten reports, telephone calls, and public appeal. 30 years later, technology had transformed nearly every aspect of daily life, and that technology had finally reached backward into the investigation. The arrest demonstrated something that would become one of the most important lessons of April's case. A cold case can remain solvable even when the original investigative tools are no longer sufficient. The evidence does not necessarily become useless simply because the methods available to analyze it have changed. Sometimes the evidence is waiting for the next generation of science. Miller's arrest also changed the public conversation around April for years. The case had been discussed as an unsolved murder. The words "unknown killer" had been part of the story for so long that they almost seemed permanent. Then the unknown killer had a name. That shift was psychologically enormous. The public could finally separate the mystery from the person. April a story was no longer only about a faceless offender who had escaped justice. It became a story about a specific man whose identity had been established through evidence. Yet the case also forced people to confront how little they had understood about the person responsible. For decades, investigators had not known whether the killer had remained in the area, moved away, changed his appearance, or lived an apparently ordinary life. The passage of time had created a false sense of distance. The killer seemed like a figure from the past, but the arrest showed that the past could suddenly become present again. Miller was not being discovered as a historical figure. He was being arrested as a living suspect. That reality made the breakthrough even more powerful. It also demonstrated the importance of continuing to preserve evidence from unsolved crimes. In April's case, investigators could not have predicted the technology that would eventually identify Miller. They could only make sure that the evidence survived. That decision became critical. Without the original biological material, genetic genealogy would have had nothing to analyze. Without a usable DNA profile, the family tree would never have been built. Without the family tree, investigators might never have reached Miller. Without the direct DNA comparison, the genealogical lead could never have become a definitive forensic connection. The entire chain depended on the evidence surviving every year between the murder and the breakthrough. That is why cold case investigations are often less about one dramatic discovery than about the preservation of possibilities. Evidence collected today may not solve a crime today. It may not solve it tomorrow, but it could become decisive decades later when a new technology emerges. April Tinsley's murder became a powerful example of that principle. The original investigators had done what they could with the science available to them. Later, investigators inherited the case and asked different questions. What could the DNA tell them? Could genetic relationships identify the offender? Could old evidence be analyzed using new technique? Those questions created a new investigative pathway. The answers eventually led to Miller, but the emotional center of the case remained April herself. She was 8 years old when she was killed. 30 years is an enormous amount of time in a human life, but for April, life stopped at 8. She never grew older. She never reached adolescence. She never graduated from high school. She never became an adult. She never had the opportunity to build the future that her family once imagined for her. The arrest could not change that. The guilty plea could not change it. The sentence could not change it. What those events could change was the uncertainty surrounding her death. Her family no longer had to ask whether the person responsible would ever be identified. Investigators no longer had to describe the killer as unknown. The community no longer had to wonder whether the case would remain unresolved forever. The truth had finally broken through. Yet even after the arrest, the investigation remained a reminder of how much time had been lost. 30 years separated April's death from the identification of her killer. 30 years during which evidence waited. 30 years during which investigators changed. 30 years during which April's family carried the absent. 30 years during which the person responsible remained outside prison. The eventual breakthrough could not erase those years. It could only give them an ending, and that ending was built from science, patience, and an investigative decision that changed the entire direction of the case. The killer had tried to disappear behind time. Instead, time became the very thing that allowed investigators to catch up with him. The technology of the future had reached into the evidence of the past, followed a genetic trail through a family tree, and finally placed a name where the word unknown had stood for decades. For investigators, it was a breakthrough. For April's family, it was an answer. For the wider world, it became a warning that old evidence should never be underestimated. Somewhere inside another forgotten case file, another biological clue might still be waiting. Another unknown profile might still have a family tree. Another killer might still believe that enough years have passed to make identification impossible. April Tinsley's case proved otherwise. The years had not erased the evidence. They had simply delayed the moment when investigators would learn how to read it. The arrest of John D. Miller marked the moment when the 30-year mystery surrounding April Tinsley finally had a name. But the investigation did not end at the moment handcuffs closed around his wrists. In many ways, that was when the most difficult questions began. For detectives, there was now a suspect whose DNA had been connected to the evidence. For prosecutors, there was a case that had to survive the legal process. For April's family, there was a reality that had taken 3 decades to arrive. The person responsible for her death had finally been identified. And for the community of Fort Wayne, the news forced an old wound open again. April had disappeared in 1988. The years had moved forward. Children had grown into adults. Families had changed. Investigators who had worked the original case had retired. Yet the name April Tinsley remained. Now the man investigators had spent years searching for was no longer an unknown figure. He was John D. Miller. The investigation had reached a turning point. But the public still wanted to know how a man could remain unidentified for so long. The answer was partly contained in the limitations of the era in which the murder occurred. When April was killed, investigators did not have the genetic genealogy techniques that would eventually expose Miller. The biological evidence could potentially identify the offender if a direct match existed, but there was no direct match waiting in a law enforcement database. The killer therefore remained invisible to the conventional system. That invisibility did not mean he had left no trace. It meant the trace could not yet be translated into an identity. The distinction would become one of the most important lessons of the case. The DNA had been there. The science to exploit it had not. 30 years later, that changed. Genetic genealogy gave investigators a new route toward the offender. Instead of searching for a known criminal, investigators searched for genetic relatives. That approach eventually narrowed the possibilities toward the Miller family. But even after Miller became a suspect, investigators needed confirmation. They could not arrest a person simply because his family tree appeared connected to an unidentified DNA profile. They needed direct evidence. That evidence came from a DNA comparison that linked Miller to the biological material associated with the crime. The breakthrough was therefore not a single piece of technology. It was a chain. Genealogy created the lead. Police work developed the lead. Forensic science confirmed the lead. The legal system then transformed that evidence into a criminal case. Each stage depended on the one before it. Remove any link, and the investigation might have remained unresolved. The case also contained another unusual feature that made the eventual identification even more striking. Investigators had received threatening communications years after April's murder. Those messages reportedly included photographs, written statements, and biological material. They were designed to remind authorities that someone knew details about the case and was willing to provoke them. At the time, investigators could not definitively identify the person responsible for the communication. They were another mystery layered on top of the original mystery. But years later, the biological material associated with those communications became important. Investigators were able to determine that the DNA was connected to the same unknown male profile associated with April's case. The messages therefore became part of the genetic trail. The offender had apparently left behind evidence while attempting to communicate with the very investigators who were searching for him. It was a cruel irony. He had tried to remain anonymous while drawing attention to the crime. Instead, the biological evidence associated with those communications helped investigators build a path toward his identity. The case began to resemble a trap that had taken decades too close. Every new piece of evidence narrowed the distance. The DNA existed. The genetic relatives provided a direction. The later biological material strengthened the connection. Eventually, investigators reached Miller, and when police approached him in July 2018, they were no longer searching blindly. According to the probable cause affidavit, detectives asked Miller whether he knew why they wanted to speak with him. His response was immediate: April Tinsley. That response was remarkable because it suggested that the name was already present in his mind before investigators explained why they had come. The case had been public for decades, and many people in Fort Wayne knew April's name. But investigators were not simply interested in recognition. They were interested in what Miller knew and why. They told him about the DNA evidence. They questioned him about April. And according to the affidavit, Miller eventually admitted that he had abducted April, assaulted her, and killed her. He also described transporting her body to the location where she was discovered. His statements became another crucial component of the case. The man investigators had reached through genetic genealogy was now allegedly providing details about the crime itself. The investigation had moved through an extraordinary sequence: an unidentified child murder, decades of unanswered questions, a surviving DNA profile, genetic genealogy, a family tree, a suspect, a direct DNA match, an arrest, and then an alleged confession. For the investigators who had inherited the case, it represented the kind of breakthrough that cold case detectives dream about but rarely experience. Yet behind the investigative triumph was the painful reality of what the evidence revealed. April had not simply disappeared. She had been taken. Her life had been deliberately ended. The person responsible had remained free for 30 years. That knowledge could not be separated from the excitement surrounding the forensic breakthrough. Solving a murder is not the same as celebrating the murder. The scientific achievement was extraordinary because it created accountability. The tragedy remained the tragedy. April was still dead. Her family was still grieving. The years could not be recovered. The legal system could only determine what happened to the person responsible after the fact. That tension became increasingly visible as the case moved toward court. Miller was initially charged with multiple offenses, and the prosecution began preparing for what could have been a lengthy legal battle. A trial would have required evidence from a crime more than 3 decades old. Witness memories would have had to be revisited. Investigators would have had to explain the genetic genealogy process. Prosecutors would have had to present the DNA evidence and the circumstances of Miller's statements. The defense would have had the opportunity to challenge the evidence. For April's family, that could have meant another prolonged period of uncertainty after 30 years of waiting. Instead, the case moved toward a plea agreement. Miller ultimately admitted guilt. In December 2018, he pleaded guilty to the charges arising from April's murder. The guilty plea meant the case would not require a full trial. It also meant that the person responsible would formally acknowledge guilt in court. For a family that had waited 30 years for an answer, that moment carried enormous weight. There was no longer a question of whether the investigation would produce a suspect. There was no longer a question of whether the suspect would face the legal system. The answer had arrived. The sentence followed. Miller received 80 years in prison, including 50 years for murder and 30 years for child molestation. The sentence ensured that the man responsible would spend the rest of his life in prison, but the courtroom could not create the kind of ending that exists in fiction. There was no moment when everything became normal again. No sentence could make April 8 years old again. No conviction could erase the memories carried by her family. No amount of prison time could return the decades stolen from everyone affected by the murder. Justice could punish. It could establish responsibility. It could provide certainty. But it could not reverse time. That was the central contradiction of the case. The investigation had succeeded, but success could not undo the crime. The DNA breakthrough could identify the killer, but it could not give April another life. Genetic genealogy could reveal a family connection, but it could not reveal the future April never experienced. The technology could solve the mystery, but it could not repair the damage. And perhaps that is why the case became so important beyond Fort Wayne. It demonstrated both the power and the limits of modern forensic science. Science can identify a person. It can connect biological evidence. It can reconstruct relationships. It can reopen a case that appeared hopeless. But science cannot erase grief. It cannot restore a victim. It cannot give families back the years spent waiting. What it can do is prevent the offender from taking the unanswered question with him forever. For decades, the killer had possessed something the investigators desperately wanted: the truth. He knew what happened to April. They did not. The genetic investigation finally took away that advantage. It gave investigators a path toward him, and once they reached him, the mystery began to collapse. That is the remarkable part of cold cases. The most important evidence may remain silent for years, sometimes decades, while investigators wait for the right tool, the right database, the right scientific technique, or the right person to recognize its value. April's case proved that evidence does not have an expiration date simply because an investigation becomes old. The DNA collected decades earlier became more powerful with time because the technology around it improved. The killer had relied on the limitations of the past. He could not predict the future. That future eventually arrived at his door, and when it did, 30 years of silence ended with a name. John D. Miller, a name that had not appeared in the original investigation as the answer, a name that emerged through a family tree, a name confirmed through DNA, a name that would ultimately be written into the final legal record of April Tinsley's murder. For the community, the arrest answered the question that had haunted Fort Wayne since 1988, but it also left behind another realization, one that reached far beyond April. If a 30-year-old case could be solved because investigators learned how to use evidence differently, then the word cold could no longer mean finished. It could mean waiting, waiting for technology, waiting for persistence, waiting for someone to look at an old clue and ask a new question. Somewhere, perhaps, another family was still waiting. Another photograph was still sitting in a case file. Another unknown DNA profile was still stored in a laboratory. Another killer might still believe the years had erased the trail. April Tinsley's case had demonstrated something different. The years had not erased the trail. They had only hidden it beneath layers of time. And eventually, investigators found a way to follow it. The arrest of John D. Miller brought the name of April Tinsley back into the national spotlight, but behind the headlines was a story far more complicated than a simple 30-year-old mystery suddenly solved. The breakthrough had exposed the killer, yet it also exposed the extraordinary amount of time that had passed since April's death. 30 years is long enough for an entire generation to grow up. It is long enough for a child's classmates to become parents and grandparents. It is long enough for detectives to retire, for neighborhoods to change, and for memories to become less precise. But April remained frozen in 1988. She was still 8 years old in every photograph, still the little girl whose family expected her to come home. Still, the child whose disappearance had changed a community forever. Now, after decades of uncertainty, investigators could finally explain how they had reached the man they believed responsible. The story began with evidence that had refused to disappear. Biological material connected to the crime had produced a DNA profile. For years, that profile had been valuable but incomplete. It could identify the offender if investigators found a direct match, but no such match appeared in the conventional systems available to police. The DNA was effectively an anonymous signature. It belonged to someone, but nobody knew who. That problem had frustrated investigators for decades. Then genetic genealogy offered a different strategy. Instead of asking whether the unknown offender was already known to law enforcement, investigators could search for people genetically related to him. The approach depended on distant relationships. The person whose DNA appeared in a genealogy database might not be the killer's parent, sibling, or child. The relationship could be much more distant. That meant the investigation required an entirely different kind of detective work. Genetic connections had to be translated into family trees. Family trees had to be reconstructed through records. Branches had to be examined and eliminated. Investigators needed to determine which people could realistically have been connected to the crime based on age, geography, and other facts. The process was not a shortcut. It was a narrowing process, and eventually the path led investigators toward the Miller family. John Miller became a person of interest, but investigators did not immediately treat the genealogical connection as proof. They needed to verify it independently. That verification came through DNA. Detectives obtained biological material associated with Miller and submitted it for forensic comparison. The result provided the direct connection they needed. The anonymous DNA profile that had remained unidentified for decades was connected to Miller. The genetic family tree had led investigators toward the right branch. The forensic comparison showed they had reached the right person. Suddenly, the investigation had something it had lacked since April's murder: a suspect whose biological evidence connected him to the case. But the story did not end there. Investigators also had to understand the strange communications that had appeared years after April's murder. These communications had added another layer of fear to an already terrifying case. Someone had apparently sent messages claiming knowledge of April's murder. Some of the communications included photographs and biological material. Their purpose seemed deliberately provocative. Whoever was behind them wanted investigators to know that someone connected to the case was still out there. For years, however, authorities did not know whether the communications were authentic or whether someone was simply exploiting the notoriety of an unsolved child murder. That uncertainty changed when forensic analysis connected biological material associated with the communications to the same male DNA profile linked to April's case. The messages had become evidence. The unknown person behind them was not merely making claims. He had apparently left biological traces that investigators could eventually use. It was an extraordinary reversal. The killer had apparently attempted to keep April's murder alive in the public consciousness, perhaps believing that the communications gave him control over the investigation. Instead, the evidence associated with those communications eventually helped investigators identify him. The very act of provoking authorities had created another trail. For detectives, that trail mattered enormously. It meant the original crime scene evidence was not the only source of biological information. There was additional material connected to the same unidentified profile. More evidence meant more opportunities to establish the offender's identity. Once Miller became the focus, investigators moved carefully. They knew that the case was too important to rely on assumptions. A 30-year-old murder required precision. Any mistake could jeopardize the prosecution. Detectives therefore worked to obtain a direct DNA sample without compromising the investigation. According to court records and investigative documents, they recovered discarded material connected to Miller and submitted it for testing. The comparison confirmed what the genealogy investigation had suggested. Miller was genetically connected to the biological evidence associated with April's murder. The case had crossed an important threshold. The unknown profile was no longer unknown. It belonged to a specific man. That moment was more than a technological victory. It represented the collapse of a 30-year wall between evidence and identity. The evidence had always contained information about the offender. Investigators simply had not possessed the tools necessary to extract the final piece. Genetic genealogy changed that. It allowed investigators to use the biological information indirectly through relatives rather than waiting for the offender himself to appear in a law enforcement database. The implications were enormous. A person could avoid arrest for decades and never submit his own DNA to a public genealogy service, yet relatives could unknowingly create genetic connections that eventually exposed him. The method transformed family history into an investigative resource, but it also created complicated questions about privacy and consent. People who submitted genetic information for ancestry research were not necessarily thinking about criminal investigations. They wanted to discover relatives, trace family origins, or understand their ancestry. Yet their genetic relationships could potentially become clues in a homicide investigation involving someone they had never met or never suspected. April's case therefore became part of a much larger discussion about the future of forensic investigation. The science could solve crimes, but society had to decide how that science should be used. In Fort Wayne, however, the immediate concern was not the future of genealogy databases. It was the past. Detectives had finally reached the man they believed had killed April. In July 2018, Miller was arrested. The news was extraordinary because April's murder had been unresolved for so long that many people had grown accustomed to seeing it described as a cold case. The arrest changed the language. The case was no longer simply an unsolved murder. It was now a prosecution. Miller's name appeared in headlines. April's photograph returned to the news. Investigators explained the genetic genealogy breakthrough. People who had followed the case for decades suddenly understood that the evidence they had been waiting for had finally arrived. But there was something else about the arrest that made it especially powerful. According to the probable cause affidavit, when detectives approached Miller and asked whether he knew why they wanted to speak with him, he responded by naming April. That detail has remained one of the most striking moments in the investigation. For decades, April's name had been associated with an unknown offender. Now the man investigators believed was responsible was saying her name himself. The silence surrounding the case had begun to break. Investigators told Miller about the DNA evidence. According to the affidavit, he eventually gave an account of April's abduction and murder. He described taking her to his residence, assaulting her, killing her, and transporting her body to the location where she was later found. Those statements, combined with the DNA evidence, created a powerful case. But investigators still had to follow the legal process. Miller was charged and initially pleaded not guilty. The prosecution faced the unusual challenge of presenting evidence from a crime more than 3 decades old. The defense could question the genetic genealogy methodology, the DNA comparisons, the circumstances surrounding Miller's statements, and the broader investigation. The case could have become a lengthy courtroom battle. Instead, Miller eventually chose to plead guilty. The decision came in December 2018 when he admitted responsibility for the charges related to April's murder. For the family, the plea meant that the uncertainty surrounding the identity of April's killer had finally ended. For investigators, it represented the culmination of decades of work. For the forensic community, it demonstrated the power of combining genetic genealogy with conventional DNA testing. The case had moved from an unidentified profile to a family tree, from a family tree to a suspect, and from a suspect to a confirmed DNA match. The technology had not solved the crime by itself. It had created a path that investigators could follow. That distinction mattered because the real achievement was not simply finding Miller. It was proving that evidence collected decades earlier could still be useful. The passage of time had not destroyed the biological trail. Instead, scientific progress had made the trail more readable. What detectives in 1988 could not see clearly, investigators in 2018 could finally interpret. The case therefore became a powerful reminder that old evidence can carry information far beyond the era in which it was collected. A sample stored for years may appear unimportant until a new scientific method gives it meaning. A report written by an investigator decades earlier may contain a detail that becomes important when combined with modern technology. A family connection that would have been invisible to detectives in the past can suddenly become the key to a murder investigation. April's case demonstrated all of those possibilities at once, yet beneath the science remained the same heartbreaking reality. A little girl had been killed, and her family had spent 30 years waiting for the truth. The breakthrough could not return April. It could not restore the years lost to uncertainty. It could only provide what the investigation had failed to provide for so long: accountability. The person responsible had been identified. He had admitted guilt, and he would eventually receive a sentence that would keep him imprisoned for the rest of his life. The case had finally reached its legal conclusion, but its significance was only beginning to spread. Investigators across the country were watching. Families with unsolved cases were watching. Scientists were watching. The question was no longer whether genetic genealogy could solve a case like April's. It had already done so. The question was how many other cases might contain the same hidden possibility. How many unknown DNA profiles were waiting in evidence rooms? How many killers had escaped identification simply because their relatives had never been connected to the investigation? How many families were still waiting for a name? April Tinsley's murder had shown that 30 years could not guarantee anonymity. Time could delay justice. It could not necessarily prevent it. Somewhere in the evidence, the truth had been waiting all along, and now investigators had learned how to find it. The guilty plea of John D. Miller brought the legal chapter of the April Tinsley investigation to an end, but it did not erase the 30 years that had come before it. For 3 decades, the case had existed as a wound that refused to close. April's name had remained connected to an unanswered question, and every anniversary of her disappearance carried the same painful reminder that the person responsible had not been identified. Then, in 2018, everything changed. A genetic genealogy investigation had led authorities toward Miller. A direct DNA comparison had connected him to evidence from the case. Investigators arrested him in July. He eventually admitted responsibility and pleaded guilty in December. The sequence was extraordinary because of how quickly the final chapter unfolded compared with the enormous amount of time that had preceded it. 30 years of uncertainty had been followed by months of identification, arrest, prosecution, and conviction. But the speed of the ending should not obscure the decades of work that made it possible. The case had survived because investigators had continued to preserve evidence, revisit leads, and search for new methods. The breakthrough was not an accident. It was the result of old evidence meeting new science. That combination became one of the most important lessons of April's story. When April was murdered in 1988, forensic technology was nowhere near where it would be decades later. Investigators could collect biological evidence, but the ability to use that evidence in the way modern genetic genealogy eventually allowed simply did not exist. A DNA profile could potentially distinguish one person from another, but if the offender was not already in a searchable database, the profile could remain anonymous. The evidence could say, with extraordinary scientific precision, that the biological material came from one particular male, but investigators still could not attach a name to that profile. That was the wall surrounding the case. They had a clue. They did not have an identity, and for years, that difference was enough to keep the killer hidden. Then the scientific landscape changed. Genetic genealogy created a new investigative pathway. Instead of requiring the offender himself to appear in a law enforcement database, investigators could search for relatives connected to the unknown profile. That meant the investigation could move through a family tree rather than directly toward a suspect. It was a completely different way of thinking about forensic evidence. The question was no longer simply, does this DNA match anyone we know? The question became, does this DNA resemble the DNA of someone who may be related to the person we are looking for? That change was revolutionary. It allowed investigators to search outward before narrowing inward. The method required specialists who understood both genetics and genealogy. Genetic relationships had to be interpreted carefully. Family trees had to be reconstructed. Potential relatives had to be examined. Investigators had to consider geography, age, family structure, and other information. A process could produce multiple possible individuals, and each one had to be evaluated. A genealogical connection was not a conviction. It was an investigative lead. Traditional police work still had to establish the final connection. In April's case, that process eventually brought investigators to John D. Miller. But the investigation did not stop with his name. Detectives needed direct forensic evidence. They needed to make sure that the person identified through genealogical research was the same person whose biological material had been associated with April's murder. The direct DNA comparison provided that confirmation. It was the moment when a theory became evidence. The anonymous DNA profile that had frustrated investigators for decades was connected to Miller. The significance of that connection cannot be overstated. For 30 years, investigators had possessed biological evidence without knowing whose body had produced it. Now they had a name. The person who had been hidden behind the profile was no longer anonymous. That development also changed the meaning of other evidence connected to the investigation. Authorities had previously received communications that appeared to come from someone claiming responsibility for April's murder. Those communications had been disturbing not only because of their content, but because they suggested that the person responsible might still be watching the investigation. Biological material associated with some of those communications eventually became important to investigators. When the DNA was analyzed, it was connected to the same unknown male profile associated with April's case. What had once seemed like separate pieces of a confusing investigation could now be understood as part of the same biological trail. The killer had apparently left evidence not only at the original crime, but also years later. The passage of time had created additional opportunities for investigators to recover information. The investigation, therefore, became a remarkable example of how evidence can accumulate across decades. The original biological material was important. The later material was important. The genealogy work was important. The direct comparison was important. No single element existed in isolation. Together, they created a chain that led to Miller. And then came the arrest. In July 2018, detectives took Miller into custody in Fort Wayne. The news shocked a community that had lived with the case for 30 years. April's murder had been discussed so often as an unsolved crime that the idea of an actual arrest almost seemed unreal. The public had grown accustomed to seeing her photograph beside the words "cold case." Suddenly, those words no longer described the investigation. The person authorities believed responsible was in custody. The identity of the offender had been established. The question that had dominated the case since 1988 had finally been answered. Yet the arrest also brought an uncomfortable realization. The offender had lived for decades while the case remained unresolved. He had aged. The world had changed around him. The technology that eventually identified him had been developed long after April's death. The investigation had moved through an entire generation before reaching him. That reality made the case a powerful reminder of how difficult justice can be when an investigation lacks the right evidence or technology at the right moment. The law can move quickly once a suspect is identified. Finding that suspect can take decades. The case also demonstrated why cold case investigators continue to revisit old evidence. An investigation that produces no answer today may produce one tomorrow. A forensic sample that cannot be used effectively in one era may become valuable in another. A database that does not exist today may become available years later. Scientific progress can change the meaning of evidence without changing the evidence itself. April's case was an example of exactly that phenomenon. The DNA had not suddenly appeared in 2018. It had been there. What changed was the ability to connect it to a person. That distinction is crucial when discussing cold cases because it reveals why some investigations remain unresolved despite the best efforts of detectives. Sometimes investigators have done everything possible with the tools available to them. The answer is simply beyond the reach of the technology of that time. The future can change that equation for April's family. However, science was never the point. The point was April. She was 8 years old when she died. Her life had barely begun. The years that followed could never replace what was lost. Every technological advance, every database search, every investigative breakthrough ultimately served one purpose: to identify the person responsible for taking her life. That purpose had finally been achieved. The guilty plea brought another kind of certainty. Miller did not simply remain a defendant waiting for a jury to determine his fate. He pleaded guilty to the charges connected with April's murder. The legal process could therefore move towards sentencing without a prolonged trial. In December 2018, Miller received an 80-year sentence, including 50 years for murder and 30 years for child molestation. The sentence guaranteed that he would remain in prison for the rest of his life. It also marked the formal end of one of Indiana's most notorious cold cases. Yet the conclusion did not produce the kind of clean, emotional ending that exists in fictional crime stories. There was no moment when the past disappeared. There was no sentence capable of restoring April to her family. There was no way to recover the decades that had passed while the killer remained unidentified. Justice could establish responsibility, but it could not reverse history. That is the reality behind almost every solved cold case. The arrest may be dramatic. The DNA breakthrough may be extraordinary. The courtroom may provide a definitive verdict, but the victim remains gone. The family still carries the loss. The community still remembers. Solving the crime changes the unanswered question, but it cannot change the event itself. What it can change is the future. For years, April's family had lived without knowing whether her killer would ever be found. That uncertainty was finally removed. Investigators no longer had to tell them that the offender was unknown. The case no longer depended on a future confession or a lucky eyewitness. The evidence had produced an answer. That answer could never make the tragedy disappear, but it could prevent the killer from taking the truth with him into old age. And the significance extended beyond April's family. Her case became part of a growing movement in forensic investigation. Genetic genealogy had demonstrated that old DNA evidence could be used in new ways. Investigators began looking at other unsolved murders, sexual assaults, and unidentified remains through the same scientific lens. Families who had waited decades began wondering whether their own cases might contain a hidden genetic pathway. Police departments began reevaluating evidence that had once been considered insufficient. Scientists and genealogists began confronting the ethical questions raised by the technique. The possibilities were enormous, but so were the responsibilities. Genetic information is deeply personal. It can reveal relationships between people who never agreed to become part of a criminal investigation. The power to identify an unknown offender through relatives therefore required careful rules and safeguards. April's case became part of that larger conversation because it showed both sides of the equation. On one side was a family waiting 30 years for justice. On the other was a technology capable of reaching into private genetic relationships to identify a suspect. The challenge was finding a responsible balance between those interests. But whatever debates followed, one fact could not be denied. The method had worked. A case that had resisted conventional investigation for 3 decades had been solved. The killer had been identified. The evidence had held. The legal system had delivered a sentence, and April Tinsley's name was no longer attached to an unknown offender. It was attached to a solved murder. Still, the most haunting part of the story remained the passage of time. 30 years had seemed to protect the killer. In the end, those same years helped create the technology that exposed him. Time had not erased the evidence. It had carried the evidence forward until investigators possessed the tools to understand it. The secret had been hidden for decades, but it had never truly disappeared. It was there in the biological evidence. It was there in the investigative files. It was there in the memories of the people who refused to forget April. And eventually, it was there in a family tree that led investigators to the man whose identity had remained hidden since 1988. The case had finally spoken. The question that had haunted Fort Wayne for 30 years had an answer. But the silence surrounding April's murder had left behind one final lesson. A cold case is not necessarily a dead case. Sometimes the evidence is simply waiting for the future to become capable of reading it. The case had been solved, but the story of April Tinsley was not finished because identifying the man responsible did something more than close a criminal investigation. It forced investigators, the community, and the public to look backward through 3 decades of unanswered questions and ask how a crime involving a child could remain without an identified offender for so long. In 1988, the investigation had begun under circumstances completely different from those of 2008. There were no searchable consumer genealogy databases. There was no modern investigative genetic genealogy. There were no sophisticated digital systems capable of connecting distant relatives across enormous family trees. Detectives worked with the evidence and technology available to them at the time, and when those tools failed to produce a name, the investigation gradually became a cold case. But cold did not mean forgotten. April's photograph remained in police files. Her name remained connected to the evidence. The biological material remained important, and somewhere inside that evidence was a genetic signature belonging to the person who had taken her life. The problem was that investigators could not yet translate that signature into an identity. That distinction would eventually become the key to understanding how the case was solved. For years, detectives had effectively been staring at an answer without being able to read it. The DNA could tell them that the same unknown male was connected to evidence associated with April's murder and later communication. It could provide a biological profile. What it could not provide was a name. Without a direct match in an available law enforcement database, the profile remained anonymous. The killer was not invisible because he had left no trace. He was invisible because the trace could not yet be connected to him. Decades later, the scientific landscape changed. Genetic genealogy offered investigators another route. Instead of searching for the offender himself, they could search for genetic relatives. The strategy was indirect, but it could transform an impossible investigation into a manageable one. A distant relative could become the first thread. That thread could lead to another family member. Records could then be examined, relationships reconstructed, and possible candidates narrowed. It was detective work conducted through genetics and genealogy at the same time. In April's case, the process eventually pointed toward the Miller family. John D. Miller became the focus of investigators, but the genealogy connection alone could never be the entire case. Investigators needed to prove that the person identified through the family tree was actually the person whose biological material had been recovered during the investigation. That was where traditional forensic science returned to the center of the story. Detectives obtained discarded biological material associated with Miller and submitted it for testing. The result connected him to the DNA profile that investigators had carried for decades. The anonymous profile finally had a name, and once that happened, every earlier piece of evidence had to be reconsidered through the lens of the new identification. The communications that had appeared years after, April's murder suddenly carried different significance. Investigators had received messages that claimed knowledge of the crime and appeared intended to frighten or provoke authority. The communications included biological material, and testing eventually connected that material to the same male DNA profile associated with April's case. What had once seemed like a bizarre and separate mystery now appeared to be part of the same trail. The person who had apparently attempted to keep the murder alive through those communications had left behind something more powerful than words. He had left DNA, and DNA does not care how many years pass. It does not care how many times an investigation changes hands. It does not care whether the offender believes the case has been forgotten. If the biological evidence remains usable, the trail can remain alive. That reality was demonstrated when investigators finally approached Miller in July 2018. The encounter was the culmination of decades of work, but it was also a moment filled with uncertainty. Investigators knew they had evidence. They knew the genealogy investigation had brought them to Miller. They knew the direct DNA comparison had strengthened the case, but they still needed to hear what Miller would say. According to the probable cause affidavit, detectives asked him whether he knew why they wanted to speak with him. His answer was striking. He said, April Tinsley. The name that had haunted investigators for 30 years came immediately from the man they believed was responsible. Detectives then confronted him with the DNA evidence. According to the affidavit, Miller eventually admitted that he had abducted April, sexually assaulted her, killed her, and transported her body to the location where she was discovered. His statements provided investigators with an account of the crime that they had spent decades trying to reconstruct. But even with the confession, the forensic evidence remained essential. The DNA was not simply a supporting detail. It was the foundation that had allowed investigators to find Miller in the first place. Without it, the genealogy investigation could not have begun. Without the genealogical connection, detectives might never have focused on Miller. Without the direct DNA comparison, the family tree lead could have remained only a possibility. The investigation therefore represented a chain of evidence stretching across 30 years. One generation of investigators collected and preserved the evidence. Another generation developed new ways to analyze it. And eventually, the two eras connected. That connection was one of the most important aspects of the case. It demonstrated why evidence from unsolved crimes must be preserved even when investigators cannot immediately determine how it will be used. The people collecting evidence in 1988 could not have known what genetic genealogy would become. They could not have predicted that distant relatives might one day provide investigators with a path to an unknown offender. They could only preserve what they had. Decades later, that decision mattered. The old evidence became new again. The same principle would soon influence investigations across the country. Families who had waited decades began asking whether their own unsolved cases might contain DNA that could be re-examined. Detectives began revisiting evidence that had once produced no answer. Scientists began refining methods for identifying people through genetic relationships. And the public began learning a new phrase: investigative genetic genealogy. The technique had gained enormous attention because it could potentially reach people who had never appeared in traditional criminal databases. But its power also raised difficult questions. A person could be identified through relatives who had voluntarily placed their genetic information into a database for completely different reasons. Those relatives might have had no connection to the crime. They might never have known the person investigators were searching for. The use of genetic information therefore demanded careful consideration of privacy, consent, and legal safeguards. The April Tinsley investigation became part of this broader debate because it represented the extraordinary promise of the technique. A child murder that had remained unresolved for 30 years had finally produced an identified suspect. Yet the case also demonstrated why the technology had to be handled responsibly. Genetic genealogy could generate leads, but leads had to be confirmed through conventional investigative methods. The process could point toward a person, but investigators still needed direct evidence before treating that person as the offender. In Miller's case, that direct evidence came through DNA. The science and the police investigation worked together. Neither existed in isolation. Once Miller was arrested, the case moved rapidly toward the courtroom. He was charged with murder, child molestation, and criminal confinement and initially pleaded not guilty. For the prosecution, the evidence was unusually powerful. There was the genetic genealogy investigation. There was the direct DNA connection. There were the communications linked to the same biological profile. And there were Miller's statements to investigators. The case that had once seemed impossible to solve now contained several independent layers pointing toward the same conclusion. Yet, April's family had already waited 3 decades. A prolonged trial could have forced them to endure another long period of uncertainty and painful testimony. Instead, Miller eventually changed his plea. On December 7, 2018, he pleaded guilty to the charges arising from April's murder. The legal system now had its answer. The person responsible had been identified, prosecuted, and held accountable. Later that month, Miller received an 80-year sentence, including 50 years for murder and 30 years for child molestation. The sentence ensured that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. For the investigation, it was the conclusion. For April's family, it was something different. It was an ending to uncertainty, but not an ending to grief. Those two things are not the same. A conviction can establish responsibility. It cannot restore the victim. A sentence can remove an offender from society. It cannot return the years that were lost. A guilty plea can answer the question of who. It cannot answer every question about the life that April should have lived. She remained 8 years old. The photograph that had circulated for decades still showed the same little girl. Nothing in a courtroom could change that, but something important had changed. Her family no longer had to wonder whether the person responsible would ever be found. The case no longer ended with the phrase unknown suspect. The mystery had a name. The evidence had produced an answer, and the answer had consequences. That was the power of the breakthrough. It did not rewrite history. It completed it. For 30 years, the final pages of April's story had been missing. In 2018, investigators finally found them. They found them in DNA. They found them in genealogy. They found them in discarded biological evidence. They found them in old investigative records. And finally, they found them in the words of the man who had been hiding behind an anonymous profile for decades. The case became a warning to anyone who believes time automatically destroys evidence. Time can change technology, it can change databases, it can change investigative methods, but time does not necessarily erase a genetic trail. The killer had been able to outrun the investigators of 1988. He could not outrun the investigators of 2018, and that difference transformed the meaning of a cold case forever. A file once considered dormant could suddenly become active. A biological sample once considered limited could suddenly become decisive. A family connection once invisible could suddenly become the road to an arrest. April's case had crossed 3 decades, but the evidence had crossed them too. And when science finally caught up with what had been left behind, the secret that had survived for so long could no longer remain hidden. The courtroom resolution of April Tinsley's murder provided something her family had been denied for 3 decades: certainty. But certainty did not arrive cleanly. It came carrying memories, unanswered questions, and the unbearable knowledge that the person responsible had remained free for most of April's lifetime. When John D. Miller pleaded guilty in December 2018, the legal system finally placed a definitive ending on the investigation, but the emotional story continued far beyond the courtroom. For investigators, the case demonstrated the extraordinary power of persistence. For forensic scientists, it became a landmark example of how genetic genealogy could transform an unidentified DNA profile into a name. For the people of Fort Wayne, it was the conclusion of a mystery that had haunted the community since 1988. And for April's family, it was the moment when a question that had followed them for 30 years finally had an answer. Who killed April? The answer was John D. Miller. But another question remained almost impossible to escape. How had he remained hidden for so long? The answer lay partly in the limitations of the time. When April was murdered, DNA evidence was still a relatively new tool in criminal investigations. Investigators could recover biological evidence and develop a profile, but a profile was useful only if there was something against which it could be compared. If the offender was not already in a database, the profile could remain unidentified. It was like having a fingerprint without knowing whose finger had made it. The evidence could prove that two pieces of biological material came from the same person, but it could not tell investigators where that person lived or what his name was. For years, that was the wall surrounding April's case. Detectives had a biological signature. They did not have a person. Decades later, the rules changed. Investigative genetic genealogy created a way around the wall. The unknown profile could be compared with genetic information from relatives, allowing investigators to reconstruct branches of a family tree and search for possible connections. The technique did not simply produce a suspect. It produced a trail. That trail eventually led investigators toward Miller. But the extraordinary part was how many separate pieces had to fall into place before the case could finally move. The original evidence had to survive. The DNA profile had to remain usable. Genealogists had to identify meaningful genetic relationships. Investigators had to reconstruct family connections. Detectives had to narrow the list. Miller had to become a viable suspect. Then his DNA had to be compared directly with the evidence. Every stage mattered. A failure at any point could have sent the investigation back into darkness. Instead, the trail continued. And when investigators finally approached Miller in July 2018, they were carrying the weight of 30 years of unanswered questions. According to the probable cause affidavit, when detectives asked him whether he knew why they wanted to speak with him, Miller identified April by name. That moment remains one of the most striking details of the case because April's name had been buried in an investigation for 3 decades, yet the man investigators believed responsible immediately understood what they were asking about. The conversation continued. Investigators confronted Miller with the DNA evidence. According to the affidavit, he eventually described his involvement in April's abduction and murder. His account gave investigators information that could be compared with the evidence already collected. The investigation now contained something that had been missing for most of its history, a direct connection between a living suspect and the crime. But the significance of the case went beyond one arrest. The investigation showed how dramatically criminal science had changed between 1988 and 2018. In 1988, detectives could not have imagined that a future genealogical database might help identify an unknown killer through distant relative. They could not have predicted that people would voluntarily provide DNA information to companies and databases in order to explore ancestry and family history. They could not have known that those genetic relationships might eventually become investigative clues. Yet that future arrived. And when it did, April's case became one of the examples showing what was possible. The breakthrough also revealed an uncomfortable truth about cold cases. Sometimes investigators do not fail because they lack determination. They fail because the available technology has reached its limit. A detective can interview every witness, search every record, follow every credible lead, and still be left with an unidentified offender. That does not necessarily mean the truth is unreachable. It may mean the necessary tool does not yet exist. April's case demonstrated what happens when that tool finally arrives. The old evidence becomes new again. The case file can be reopened. The questions can be asked differently. The same biological material that once produced only an anonymous profile can suddenly become the first step toward a family tree. And family tree can lead to a person. That person can then be tested against the original evidence. Suddenly, a mystery that seemed permanent becomes solvable. Yet the investigation also exposed the emotional cost of waiting. 30 years is more than a period of time on a calendar. It is an entire human generation. People who were children when April was killed were adults when her killer was arrested. Investigators who had once walked through the original investigation had grown older or retired. Technology had moved from paper files and early forensic databases to sophisticated genetic analysis. The city itself had changed, but April's family had carried the same absence through every one of those years. Every birthday that never happened, every school year that never came, every holiday without her, every family photograph missing the adult she would have become. The arrest could not restore those years. The conviction could not restore them. The 80-year sentence could not restore them. Justice does not work backward. It works forward. It establishes responsibility for what cannot be undone. That distinction is crucial when discussing cold cases because the word solved can create the illusion that everything has been repaired. It has not. A solved homicide still leaves a victim dead. A conviction still leaves a family grieving. A prison sentence still leaves memories that cannot be changed. What solving the case provides is truth, and truth matters. For 3 decades, uncertainty had been part of April's family story. Now uncertainty had been replaced by facts. The offender had been identified. The evidence had been confirmed. The prosecution had reached a guilty plea. The court had imposed a sentence. The case no longer depended on speculation. That transformation was the real meaning of the breakthrough. It converted a haunting mystery into a documented criminal case. It also demonstrated why investigators continued to revisit old evidence. In April's case, the biological material had survived long enough for modern science to use it. The investigation had not been forgotten. It had been waiting for an opportunity. That opportunity arrived when investigators combined genetic genealogy with conventional forensic methods. The genealogy investigation generated a lead. Direct DNA testing strengthened it. Miller's statements added another layer. The legal system then produced the final outcome. It was not one miracle. It was a sequence of smaller breakthroughs that finally connected, and that sequence became a model for other cold cases. Investigators began asking whether unidentified DNA profiles from other crimes could be examined through genealogical method. Families of victims began hoping that cases once considered impossible might be reopened. Forensic laboratories began confronting the possibilities and limitations of the new science. The public began to understand that a killer who had avoided identification for decades could still be vulnerable to evidence collected long before modern technology existed. April's case therefore became larger than April's case. It became part of a transformation in how investigators thought about the passage of time. Previously, decades could make a case seem increasingly impossible. Now, decades could mean that technology had more time to develop. The passage of time could still hurt an investigation by weakening memories, destroying records, or losing witnesses. But biological evidence could become more useful as science improved. That created a strange contradiction. Time was both the enemy and the ally. 30 years had separated the murder from the arrest, but those same 30 years had allowed science to develop the tools that eventually exposed the offender. Miller had escaped identification under the conditions of 1988. He could not escape the conditions of 2018. The future had changed the rule, and the most powerful evidence against him had survived long enough to take advantage of that change. When Miller received his 80-year sentence, the legal system had finally answered the question that had remained open since April's death. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, but outside the courtroom, April's story remained something different. She was not a case number. She was not a DNA profile. She was not a headline about genetic genealogy. She was an 8-year-old girl whose life had been violently interrupted. The science that solved her murder mattered because it served her memory. The investigation mattered because it gave her family an answer. The conviction mattered because it established accountability. And the passage of time mattered because it proved that even after 30 years, the evidence had not surrendered. Somewhere inside the old case file, the truth had remained intact. It had waded through changing detectives, changing technology, changing databases, and changing generations. Then the right people found the right way to read it. The mystery that had once seemed immortal finally had an ending, but the deeper lesson remained unsettling. A person can disappear from the attention of investigators. A case can disappear from the front pages. A community can eventually stop expecting an answer, yet evidence can remain. Silent, patient, unforgiving, waiting for the moment when science, persistence, and circumstance finally align. For April Tinsley, that moment came 30 years too late to save her, but not too late to identify the person who had taken her life. And that distinction became the final legacy of the investigation. Time had delayed justice, but it had not destroyed the possibility of justice.